Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to be travelling around Calradia, restocking royal stew. Join me as I do that and listen to the next 2 episodes of Hell on Earth, the podcast about the 30 Years' War.
On the 10th of August, 1628, an enormous new warship set sail from Stockholm Harbor. This was the Vasa, commissioned by King Gustavus Adolphus. It was to be the new flagship of the Swedish Navy. It was a weapon capable of securing Swedish domination of the Baltic and beyond, and an announcement of Sweden's ascent as one of the great powers of Europe. The ship was over 225 feet long, 38 feet wide, had a displacement of 1,333 tons, and was powered by 10 sails, with the capacity for 145 sailors and 300 soldiers, and equipped with 64 new bronze cannons. It was one of the most powerful warships ever constructed at the time, beautifully and intricately decorated, lined with carved statues, painted in vibrant colors. The Vasa was the physical manifestation of the glory, power, and prestige of the Swedish Empire. The ship left port for the first time in front of a crowd of hundreds of onlookers, from everyday Swedes to foreign dignitaries and ambassadors. Sailing with its gun ports open to display its power, the ship set its massive sails and began to depart the harbor. But, still within sight of the onlookers, as soon as a light gust of wind hit the sails, the Vasa tipped to one side. Water flooded into one of the open ports of its gun decks, and in a matter of moments, the ship sank like a rock. From the Navy Yard to the bottom of the harbor in about 20 minutes. About 30 of the 150 crew members on board went down with the ship. It had been built too tall and too heavy, and though some attempts had been made to subtly alter the designs, they had been personally approved by the king. And now those designs were at the bottom of the ocean, before they could even fire a shot.
The Vasa, O Bungle, is a perfect symbol of Sweden's abortive stab at continental power in the 17th century. This is a country of few resources and few people, but it had the advantage of a compact social structure and a relatively weak aristocracy. As such, Sweden was able to coordinate resources and act with far more efficiency than much larger rivals. And the Swedes were able to synthesize many of the technological and doctrinal advances wrought by the military revolution and put them to devastating use. But, regardless of Swedish ingenuity or determination, there are only so many guns you can fit on the deck of a single warship before it tips over in the wind. Incidentally, if you want to see the Vasa, it is on display at a museum in Stockholm. They dug it out of the bay in the 60s, and it's fully preserved. It's amazing.
I dreamed to see it one day, and we know that the 30 of the 150 crew died because they found their freaking skeletons on board the ship.
Yep, and wouldn't you know it, all of them brutally malnourished and often missing limbs and crucial bones.
And you have to imagine that on the initial sail of the ship, that was the cream of the Swedish Navy, and there were still like one-armed guys in there.
They've got rickets. It was a shitty time, folks, in many ways.
Though the Vasa disaster was certainly a black eye for Gustavus Adolphus, at this point in our story of the 30 Years' War, he is nonetheless the man of the moment. With another collapse of the Protestant alliance in Germany, with the failure of his Danish rivals across the Öresund, and with his conflict in Poland wrapped up for the moment, Gustavus Adolphus turned the might of the Swedish Empire onto Germany. And for the first time in the conflict, it seems like perhaps the power of the Habsburgs had met their match. The Lion of the North. Gustavus Adolphus was born on December 9th, 1594, the son of the Protestant Duke Charles Vasa and his second wife. In Gustavus's youth, his father fought a dynastic war against Gustavus's cousin, Sigismund III of Poland, a Catholic who had held the Swedish throne since 1592. Charles won this conflict in 1599 and then became King Charles IX in 1604, but in the process creating ongoing tensions between Poland and Sweden. Charles proceeded to get Sweden involved in conflicts in Russia and with the Danes, then promptly died in 1611, leaving Gustavus to ascend to the throne at age 17 in the middle of 3 wars. Gustavus was raised from childhood to be a king and a warrior. As a boy, he played in his father's office as the king conducted business. He first accompanied a military campaign at the age of 6. By age 10, he was allowed to give opinions at the Privy Council, and a few years later, he was receiving ambassadors by himself. Gustavus was broad-minded, strong, smart, and direct in his rule. He dressed as a soldier and expected as much from his servants as he wouldn't take shit from his nobles. He was also one of the most capable administrators in all of Europe. He had taken Sweden from the fractious disunity of the war with Sigismund to one of the most efficient states in the continent. He constrained and focused the nobles into a bureaucratic management body called the Riddarhus. He developed the mineral wealth of his kingdom, built domestic industry suitable for equipping everything an army could need, and devised one of the first modern conscription programs to create a powerful army without the need for mercenaries. And yes, he personally approved of the Vasa. But I mean, come on, we all get a mulligan here or there.
Come on, that's why pencils have erasers.
That's just one ship. Gustavus possessed a level of self-confidence above and beyond almost every other leader of the moment. His unwavering assuredness in his own action, from the smallest decisions of court to the most consequential matters of martial strategy and tactics, inspired awe from his men and fear from his enemies. An Italian mercenary in his employ was paid to assassinate Gustavus, and though the soldier had several opportunities and more than once took aim with his pistol, he found he simply could not bring himself to pull the trigger, being overpowered by the raw, radiating charisma and confidence of the king. It was said of Gustavus, quote, "He thinks the ship cannot sink that carries him." Ironic, yes, but perhaps the Vasa sank simply because the king was not on it at the time.
Yes, Gustavus Adolphus is the kind of king that gives monarchy a good name. If hereditary rule consistently produced men of his will, ability, charisma, it would be hard to argue for any other form of class society doing better. But none of Gustavus's attributes could change the fact that he ruled over a cold, sparsely populated realm cut off from the economic heart of Europe by the Baltic. His young rule was dominated by wars with his neighbors in Russia, Denmark, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where he had a hereditary claim on the throne. If Sweden was to continue punching above its weight, it needed to dominate the eastern Baltic and prevent Denmark from exercising sole control of shipping, so Swedish foreign policy was guided by a focus on regional expansion. War in Poland and the empty Swedish treasury that resulted from it is what stopped Gustavus from accepting the role of Protestant champion after the defeat of the Bohemian Revolt. But Cardinal Richelieu was not going to allow such a powerful potential ally to fritter away his resources romping around Prussia while the Emperor and Wallenstein solidified Habsburg power across Central Europe. French diplomats were able to broker a truce with Poland while also opening negotiations on a monetary subsidy to underwrite a Swedish invasion of Germany. With uneasy peace achieved to his east and Baltic rival Denmark brutally humbled by Wallenstein's army, Gustavus was free to make a dramatic entrance onto the German stage.
I feel like French diplomat would be a good job in this era.
Oh my God, they were a bunch of Jesuit monks, and they would just scuttle around, whispering in people's ear on behalf of the cardinal.
Yeah, so they all spoke in very high, fancy French, so it was almost like people were multilingual at the time, but it was said the French diplomats almost had like a secret language of their own. And
Richelieu's mentor had been a Jesuit named Father Joseph.
Yes.
And during this period, Richelieu is sending Father Joseph all over the course of Europe to stir shit up. He sent him to Regensburg to make sure that Ferdinand III was not confirmed as King of the Romans, get rid of Wallenstein, negotiate with Bavaria. Those guys were all over the place at the helm of really the most sophisticated diplomatic apparatus of any of these states.
Right.
They were matched by the Spanish simply because Spain just bribed everybody. Like, they didn't need to have all these guys going around being all sneaky.
Playing
it was
people
just like
across each other.
drop a bunch of doubloons in their lap.
Yes.
And that works too.
The sweet tongue and the bag of silver, you know?
Yes.
Gustavus Adolphus seems to have had precisely one friend, one advisor in the world. If Gustavus was the strength, charisma, and genius of empire, then it was his chief chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, who is the cool, methodical, organizational core of the government. Essentially, Gustavus was the Chad and Oxenstierna was the nerd, but they functioned hand in hand to build Sweden to its heights. Oxenstierna was a brilliant diplomat, reserved yet friendly, honest but shrewd, completely devoted to the king and to the development and betterment of the Swedish people. And through his dedicated, high-minded work, one of the people most responsible for prolonging the bloodshed in Germany for another decade and a half.
Oops.
Yes.
So Oxenstierna is the ice to Gustavus's fire and the point man in negotiations with the French on the Swedish entrance to the war. Of course, Sweden, as a Lutheran country, espoused religious horror at the emperor's brutal counter-Reformation efforts. But as Gustavus once pointed out, if he was really interested in defending Protestantism, he would have declared war on the Pope.
Go for it, dude.
Yeah, just do it.
Just do it.
Do it. The real motivation for intervention was security. Wallenstein's Baltic design may have failed, but the effort, which involved the construction of a canal that would have allowed merchant ships to circumvent Danish tollways, came far too close to fruition for Gustavus and Oxenstierna's comfort. They had managed to build a promising, nascent empire, controlling Finland and Livonia in modern-day Latvia, with a credible claim to Norway as well. But Swedish power would be strangled in its crib if the Habsburgs succeeded in turning the Baltic into their private lagoon. There was a deep national interest in seeing the imperial constitution amended to reduce the emperor's authority, allowing Sweden to create a sphere of influence containing the northern Protestant principalities, and restricting Habsburg power to their hereditary lands in Austria. Not to mention, and the Swedes were careful not to mention it to their German allies once the invasion began, intervention opened the door to the possibility of establishing direct Swedish control over some portion of the German lands. The revenues from conquered territory could then go to pay the army that had spent so many years fighting in Poland. As one member of the Swedish Diet noted, it is better to tie the goat to the neighbor's gate than one's own.
Such a 17th century Swedish idea. Yes.
It's all goat related.
It's all goat.
Every single thing is a goat metaphor.
Yes. So what do we make of Sweden at the at this phase of the 16th century state development? Why are they able to do all the things that they're able to do at this exact moment?
Well, part of it has to do with, as I said, the relatively weak aristocracy and empowered peasantry that existed in Sweden. In the Swedish Diet that it was just referred to, there was a peasant chamber. So there was actual peasant representation in the parliamentary government.
Right.
And what that meant is that the Vasa dynasty was able to make sort of common cause with this state bureaucracy that had this popular legitimacy to break through the morass of particular elite interests that compose the nobility and that hinder every other state in its attempt to create a meaningfully functional apparatus.
We've been talking about this throughout the last few episodes, that the chief struggle with creating a state here is that you don't have a power share. There's no buy-in from the nobility.
Right.
The nobility is trying to pull the state apart. Your monarch is trying to pull a state together.
Right.
And here they don't have a strong nobility, and he's able to actually make the nobility do the work of managing the state in the Ritterhus.
Yes, and they are able to do, as Chris said earlier, they're able to institute a conscription program unique in Europe to just go and say, hey, in this zone, in this census tract, you need to bring me 100 guys for the army, as opposed to just having a bunch of freebooters just put a bunch of guns and lances on a credit card and then get a bunch of drunks to pull out of a fucking tavern, grab them, and then just go and charge the whole thing to the emperor.
Yes.
They're able to actually direct and control a national military corps. They use a lot of mercenaries, but as adjuncts to this real, like, fully articulated proto-state apparatus of a proto-national military.
Right.
But of course, why are they able to do this? Why don't they have this layer of thieving and grasping nobles? Because it's the fucking it's the middle of nowhere. It's fucking frozen. There's nothing there. You can't grow shit. There's nothing. There's no resources. There's nothing anyone wants. Therefore, they're not going to get your swarm of nobles to cut over the carps. It's the same reason that there's no really embedded feudalism in the Low Countries.
Right.
At which point they were undrained swamps. And in those places, noble rule is weakest. And then you get the ability for this nascent national structure to emerge that unifies interests and pushes them in one direction. But you can only push so far against the limits of your material base, and which is one reason that Gustavus saw the only future of Swedish power in dominating continental Europe, getting tribute from the rich, actually fertile, not frozen all the time, German lands of central and northern Germany.
So, to that end, on July 4th, 1630, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden's fleet met the German shore of the Duchy of Pomerania, and the king stepped onto German lands at Usedom, right on the modern border of Germany and Poland. While disembarking, the king tripped, stumbled, and fell to one knee, which people immediately said was because he had been driven to his knee in a holy reverie, asking God for his blessing. Gustavus landed with a force of 13,000 men. Paltry when you consider Wallenstein's 150,000-man monster, but it was a new beast on the field of Germany, a unified national army with intense discipline, state-of-the-art tactics, and marching behind a warrior king.
So up until this point, armies in the field were mostly mercenaries, as we said, recruited from all over the empire and beyond. Multilingual, multinational, multi-religious, unified only by loyalty to who was ever signing their checks each month. The Swedish army was composed almost entirely of citizens of Gustavus's Swedish Empire. Whether they were Swedes, Laplanders, or Finns, they were all subjects of Gustavus Adolphus, who was their king and sovereign, commander, and fellow soldier who fought right alongside them. The cavalry and artillery regiments were almost uniformly Swedes, and while the infantry filled out its ranks with various Scots recruited from Charles I's Britain and Germans picked up along the way, they were folded into this singular national military project in a much more concrete way than their mercenary counterparts, who would just as often switch banner for higher pay after a losing battle, sticking around with their current company. While the army contained troops of various religions, unity through Lutheranism was enforced. The army prayed twice daily, and soldiers were assigned a book of Lutheran hymns, so again, they could all sing the word of God together. The elite core of the Swedish cavalry, though, was composed of Finns. They were known as Hakapaletas, which is Finnish for cut them down, which is what they would yell as they would ride through retreating infantry and cut them down with their sabers. They would yell, cut them down. So they were Hakapaletas. And they were the most feared of all of the Swedish troops. When the Finns showed up to your village, you were fucked.
Would they also ride reindeer?
There were many accounts, and there are many woodcuts and carvings of Finnish cavalry on reindeer, just to emphasize how alien they were. Their language was the most alien. They were the most scary because they were the most alien part of the Swedish army. By the way, the imperial version of that is the Croatian cavalry,
Yes.
who were the most culturally and linguistically alien of the imperial Catholic forces, and as such, the ones who were most feared by the peasantry.
Also, fun fact, the necktie came from Croatian uniforms being admired by some of their more fashionable allies like the French around this time. But just on that note, I don't think we've quite mentioned it yet, but one of the things I find funniest about this period of war is that often when two armies met in battle, they would all fight each other. One would get exhausted, one would win, and then the losers would just walk over and become part of the winner's army.
Yep, they would just sign a new contract of service.
Yes.
And furthermore, Gustavus developed a kind of egalitarianism in his army. Units were cross-trained, giving cavalry and infantry some capability with artillery, and both artillery and infantry were given riding training. This allowed various units to take over for down specialty units, literally picking up a gun if their comrade went down, or possibly immediately putting artillery captured from the enemy on the battlefield back into use without waiting to drag it back to the Swedish line.
On top of this, Gustavus's army brought new, smaller, more mobile guns into their formation, finally creating a mobile cannon infantry that could outmatch the feared Spanish tercios version of the pike and shot formation. All of these innovations have led Gustavus to be called the father of combined arms in warfare, linking his various units, cavalry, artillery, and infantry into a single fearsome machine of highly agile, highly responsive, highly destructive force. Finally, Gustavus enforced strict discipline among his ranks. Even the Swedes had difficulty keeping their army paid regularly, and all the while the king was on campaign, Oxenstierna was cracking open the finances, looking for every fee, duty, toll, tax, and custom he could juice an extra percentage point of income out of. But what Gustavus did provide was some of the best supplies and rations of the conflict. The entire army was kept well-fed and well-supplied with cloaks, gloves, stockings, and waterproof boots, which you got to imagine, that's a huge plus. If you don't have waterproof boots in this 30 Years War,
you're
goddamn.
practically a super. It's like a mech suit.
Yes. Just having a sealed leather on your feet, yes. And so Gustavus demanded strict restraint from the kind of brutal local plunder that kept the mercenary armies supplied, with violators being summarily court-martialed and shot. But this then meant that if there was ever a need to strategically raise an area, Gustavus could release his men to plunder, and the Swedes would descend on the land with the particularly intense ravenousness of an unshackled animal.
Yeah, one of the things that was notable about the Swedish troops is that they would march into battle with full complacency, eyes blank, mouths slack, basically dead already.
Emotionless.
In the great Lutheran tradition, the great Swedish Lutheran tradition of, I have been freezing my balls off on a hell-swept plain for my entire life. The world holds no pleasures for me. I am already dead. And it was very unnerving to the more carnally inclined Catholic armies.
The beer and sausage barbarians.
Yeah, the beer and sausage Germans seeing that, and they get creeped out fast.
Yes. I mean, we were talking about the alienness of the Swedish army before. Their descent into Germany, as we're going to outline in this episode, is basically like the stormtroopers arriving.
Yeah. It's a steamroller. It is in a relentless 500-mile wide swath that runs, we'll say it again, but it runs broadly diagonally from northeast to southwest.
Yes.
And everything before it is just pulled up, and along the way, they pick up allies, they pick up deserters and prisoners of war, and it just becomes this the unstoppable momentum. So in June of 1630, in the Pomeranian city of Stralsund, on the eve of Gustavus's landing, the Swedes first published the king's manifesto justifying his invasion and declaring his intentions in the German lands. By the end of the year, it went through 23 editions in 5 languages. Written by a Swedish diplomat in the voice of the king, the manifesto cited the emperor's intervention on behalf of Gustavus's Polish enemies, who were also the emperor's in-laws, as a justification for a retaliation. The invasion was framed not as a religious crusade against the papal Antichrist, but as a defense of German liberties from the threat of Habsburg tyranny. Yet the Protestant German princes were slow to rally to his cause. Gustavus's army easily seized effective control of the sandy backwater of Pomerania, annexing Stralsund outright and strong-arming the Duke into providing funds to the Swedes and acknowledging the Swedish right to sequester his dukedom upon his death, basically telling him, you thought your eldest son was going to get Pomerania after we got bad news for you, it's going to the king after you die. This made some of the princes anxious at the prospect of trading one imperial tyranny for another. The Protestant Chancellor of Brandenburg told a convention of princely representatives, the Swede is a foreign king who had no business in the empire. But Gustavus was not going to take no for an answer. He told his wife's brother, also from Brandenburg, I don't want to hear about neutrality. His Grace will be my friend or my foe. This is a fight between God and the devil. If His Grace is with God, he must join me. If he is for the devil, he must fight me. There is no third way. Now that, of course, didn't stop old John George of Saxony from trying to find one.
John George of Saxony, Beer George, always caught between his cautious Protestantism and his princely rights, gets George William of Brandenburg on board to oppose this foreign intervention. And I'm sorry already, dear listeners, but this entire episode we're going to be talking about John George and George William. It gets a little confusing. John George is Saxony, always trying to find a third way. George William is the Elector of Brandenburg, and he's also a bit of a pussy, trying to find a third way. But John George is the
moderate bloc
yes.
of Protestant electors.
Right.
And they are in the the west, the east and north of Germany.
Yes.
And they're basically the lands directly bordering the region that Gustavus is invading.
So together they convened a meeting of the Protestant princes at Leipzig in spring 1631. There, they petitioned Ferdinand, "We are ready to make peace in Germany against the Swedish menace if we can do something about the Edict of Restitution and the imperial armies that are still in the field." John George, with Wallenstein's general von Arnim, begins fielding an army in the north, competing with Gustavus for men, supplies, and dominance. Emperor Ferdinand, presented with a broad alliance of princes, crossing religious divisions, ready to stand together in common cause for the unity of the empire against the menace of foreign invaders, of course, rejects the offer.
Oy.
Rescinding the edict would, of course, be heresy. Surely these electors were just making the same flaccid demands they had been making for over a decade. Ferdinand, man, learn to take a deal. Come on.
Take yes for an answer, dude. I mean, it's this devil's knot because it is driven by Ferdinand's genuine religious conviction that he had a duty as emperor to re-Catholicize the empire, and that he had to continue resisting. That the edict was crucial to that, but also the edict was the structure that the edict was how he was going to carry out the project of Habsburg domination,
right?
And maintaining and battening up and supporting in the face of this deep crisis that they were in. The continued domination of the empire. So he might have been better off not to do it, but at the same time, is there any deal he makes with those Brandenburg and Saxony that does not ultimately undermine his authority? So while the Saxons are dithering and Ferdinand is looking a gift horse in the mouth, Gustavus is able to make an alliance with Hesse-Kassel, whose landgrave banked on Gustavus rewarding his early loyalty with an electoral position in a reformed post-war empire. Most of Gustavus's early German allies were these marginal princes. Like the big boys are like, nuh-uh.
Yes.
But the guys who aren't electors, who aren't in the top tier, they see Gustavus as their meal ticket. They are marginal princes. They felt slighted by the current imperial constitutional settlement. Maybe I get to be the elector of Hesse-Kassel. So they sign up with Gustavus. The most dramatic declaration for Gustavus, though, came in that proud evangelical city of Magdeburg, which had so dramatically held out against an imperial siege during the Smalkaldic Wars. Magdeburg's Lutheran Archbishop Christian Wilhelm, oh goddamn,
another Christian, goddammit,
another Christian and another Wilhelm, motherfucker.
Get some new names, 17th century Germany.
New names, 17th century Germany. And its city council had supported the Danes during their invasion, which led to Christian Wilhelm being banished from the city, and the city then being occupied by imperial troops. Shortly after the Swedish forces entered Germany, though, Christian Wilhelm snuck into the city under cover of night and rallied the council to expel the occupiers and swear allegiance to Gustavus. The auspicious occasion was marked by the screeching of ravens and a sunset that turned the Elbe River blood red.
Good signs. Good signs.
All good signs. Good decisions being made by everyone in Magdeburg. The Habsburg military response was hampered by Maximilian of Bavaria.
Yes.
He's reluctant to fight the Swedes and risk alienating their ally Richelieu, who he's conducting his own diplomacy with. Wallenstein made matters worse by obstructing the handover of command to Count Tilly. He'd go, but he would not go out gracefully. Tilly was denied access to supplies and lodging held by Wallenstein, and many of the officers left the service with their chief. The army was dissolving before Tilly's eyes. He wrote despairingly, "All the days of my life, I have never seen an army so lacking in everything at one and the same time, from the most important to the least. No draft horses, no officers, no cannon, no powder, no ammunition, no picks or shovels, no money, and no food." The fall and winter of 1630 passed in relative quiet, while Gustavus attempted to gather allies and Ferdinand gathered troops. In January of 1631, Oxenstierna finalized a treaty with Richelieu for a $400,000 a year subsidy. I know it's like, what is this? What does that mean? It's a lot of money, okay?
Yes.
Just think big mouths.
Try to count to 400,000.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's made of gold or silver or whatever. It's valuable.
Yes.
You can wage war on it for a while. Richelieu hoped that the Swedes would be a useful proxy in the French effort to reduce Habsburg power, but not be so successful as to become a threat on their own. Which member of the partnership, Sweden or France, would hold the upper hand would fully be determined by feats of Swedish arms. By the spring of 1631, after initial skirmishes with imperial troops, Swedish and Allied forces had secured control of almost all of Baltic Germany down to the Oder River. Ferdinand and Maximilian were able to bring 12,000 troops into the field, with another 25,000 freed up in Italy by the end of the Mantua War, who were sent over the Alps in May.
So, I mean, the one thing that I think about here is, like, remember that this time last year in the story, Wallenstein had 150,000 men in the field.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the army dissolving in front of Tilly, and the important thing is that Ferdinand has to fire Wallenstein, but Wallenstein is more than just his men. He's the genius of logistics.
He is the actual brains of the operation.
Yes.
It all runs on him. And as we said, the top officers under his command are essentially his creatures and go with him. So the military is, from a command perspective, decapitated, and he takes all of his capital with him and goes home. He takes his ball and goes home.
Because remember, he had turned Friedland into a perfectly efficient war-making machine.
Yeah.
And without him, you don't have any of that. No boots, no waterproof boots.
It's all going away, and people just start, like, what happened with these armies is that once supplies stopped coming in, people would just start walking away.
Yeah.
They would just leave. And maybe they would find the nearest
bricks.
Maybe
If it
they would
sucks, hit
find
the bricks.
the other army. Hey,
Yeah.
I'll go over to the Swedes and I'll sign up with them. And they would just, like, stop until they hit another army and joined it. But if there's nothing coming in and no promise of it, there's nothing to stop people from just leaving. And that's what would happen until you were able to bring in the supplies to gather people around.
And we'll talk about this more in a future episode, but that's one of the things you have to keep in your head about how destructive this war is. It's not just the armies meeting in the field and fighting each other. It's bringing these 150,000 people across the land, and they just go into the next town and take anything they need to live or eat.
The way to think of 17th century European armies is that they are giant, mobile, armed music festivals. they are hundreds of thousands in some cases of guys, but
Yes.
not just the soldiers and not just support personnel. You've got entire families.
Right.
Guys would travel with their wife and kids, who would all live. They would all live together. Obviously, all kinds of prostitutes and peddlers, supplying them with alcohol and food and supplies. An entire economy, a moving city that needed to be fed. And so it would be as a locust stripping the land as it moved across Europe. And that's why the tactics so much end up being about keeping your army in enemy territory until there's no more food in the cupboard.
Meanwhile, the situation in Magdeburg had become dire. With Christian William reasserting control of the city, General Tilly had dispatched Field Marshal Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim to besiege the city, which he did in late March 1631. Magdeburg remained one of the most fervently Protestant strongholds, a necessary node of power Gustavus sought to link up with. He had dispatched one of his commanders to help fortify the city, but soon the number of Catholic troops surrounding the city grew to equal the total population of the city itself, a city surrounded by a city of war.
Yep.
While Gustavus attempted to negotiate passage and support from the recalcitrant Protestant electors of Brandenburg and Saxony, negotiations between Tilly and Pappenheim's forces and the Magdeburg city councilors deteriorated. Finally, on May 20th, 1631, despite a last desperate motion for surrender being made by the city burghers, Tilly ordered a final assault on the city.
Pappenheim, a Catholic convert
Hey, another one of those guys.
who had vowed to suffer a wound for every year he spent as a Protestant heretic,
That's hardcore. That's metal.
and had led the brutal repression of those Austrian peasant rebels we talked about, and had earned the nickname Scarred Heinz after being shot up at White Mountain and left for dead. This guy is like your empire defined.
You know, he's also like your classic, like, second in command. You know, a Bond villain
Yes.
always has a scary goon.
A scary guy, yeah, like
who has one eye shot out or
Charles
something.
Dance in Last Action Hero.
Yes, exactly. So Pappenheim is the scary goon
Yeah,
to
he's a very scary goon.
to Tilly's army.
He issued his 18,000 Imperial and Catholic League troops a wine ration and then sent them into the city from 5 directions simultaneously. Thus, fortified by alcohol, driven stir-crazy by months of siege duty, the soldiers rushed forward. Those Croatian cavalry found an undefended side gate and tore through the city streets, interrupting the city council while it was in the middle of arguing with the Swedish commander about whether to surrender or not. More of Tilly's troops poured into the city. Soon a fire broke out, its flames carried by winds across the entire town. It was probably set by Pappenheim to flush out musketeers hiding in a house by one of the city gates. Later, the fire was attributed to the malevolence of the Catholic forces or to a mythical Magdeburg maiden who supposedly set herself ablaze rather than fall into imperial hands. Whatever the cause, by the end of the day, 1,700 of the 1,900 buildings had burnt to the ground. Tilly attempted to prevent his troops from pillaging and was able to protect the 1,000 or so people who took refuge in the city's cathedral, but after months spent suffering, underpaid, and starving in siege trenches, their lust for blood and loot could not be constrained. Soldiers plundered wine cellars, drinking themselves into unconsciousness, only to be suffocated by the fire, mugs in hand. Civilians were tortured for the location of their valuables and murdered. A memoir later written by a survivor recalled, "We saw very many dead in the alleys and a number of women lying totally naked with their heads in a large beer barrel which was standing full of water in the street. They had been pushed in and drowned, but half their bodies and legs were hanging out, which was a wretched spectacle." The generals gestured at chivalry. Pappenheim himself placed Christian Wilhelm, the archbishop, under his personal protection, and Tilly was seen riding his horse through the city, holding an infant he had taken from the arms of its dead mother. Nevertheless, of the 30,000 inhabitants of Magdeburg, fewer than 5,000 survived the sack. Most of them women, taken as spoils of war into the imperial camp. It took 2 weeks for the wagon loads of corpses to be cleared from the burning city. Pappenheim later wrote, "I consider it cost the city more than 20,000 souls, and most certainly no greater horror and divine justice have been seen since the destruction of Jerusalem. All our soldiers have become rich men." 5 days after the sack, Count Tilly rededicated the cathedral with full procession of troops, with their colors and cannons firing into the walls of the city. Magdeburg Cathedral was once again a beacon of Catholicism, standing over a deserted heap of death and ash. The sack and burning of Magdeburg was immediately seized by the Protestant side as a propaganda weapon against the emperor. In 1631, over 200 pamphlets and 40 broadsheets about the sack were published across the continent, with titles like "Copy of Letter from Magdeburg" and "Short but True and Proper Report How the Capture and Destruction of the Ancient and Famous City of Magdeburg Took Place." They gloried in the horrifying details and condemned the imperial and League forces as blood-drunk savages no better than Turks. But of course, since the authors of these pamphlets were Protestants, some of them couldn't totally let the Magdeburgers off the hook. The Short and Proper Report observed that the city fathers must have faltered in their faith and neglected to seek penance from the Lord if such a harsh punishment were ever to occur. With such benighted leadership, it was inevitable that just as Christ was crucified, that much innocent blood was spilled to such ungodly landsknechts. R.I.P. to them, but I'm different.
The shadow of Magdeburg would loom over the rest of the war. Terms like Magdeburgization and Magdeburg Quarter would be used as grim shorthand by the Protestants for the complete destruction and violent eradication of their enemies. The same justice they had been shown at Magdeburg. More immediately, it brought those Protestant forces on the fence about the Swedish intervention into more confident alliance with the king. The United Provinces soon joined the French in directing subsidies to his efforts and made plans to go on the offensive into the Spanish Flanders. Spanish Flanders.
Stupid Spanish Flanders.
George William of Brandenburg, previously attempting to walk the line between Imperial and Swedish forces, finally capitulated and signed a treaty with the king, offering key forts and resources of Brandenburg to his cause. 1 month after the siege, on June 22nd, 1631, Gustavus Adolphus and George William spent a wild day and night of feasting and drinking together in Berlin. While Gustavus and George William partied, Tilly's victory at Magdeburg was already turning to ash in his mouth. Bizarrely, Richelieu had signed a secret treaty with Maximilian of Bavaria, recognizing Maximilian as the rightful elector of Palatine, and binding each other in support if attacked, and not to attack each other's enemies. But Tilly was not just the imperial general, but the general of Maximilian's Catholic League forces, and was now bound by treaty not to attack France's allies, namely the Swedes, even though the same treaty recognized Maximilian's electorate, even while one of Gustavus's stated goals was returning the electorate to Frederick V. And my God, Freddy V is still hanging out in the wings, trying to get all his goddamn claims restored.
Oh my God, could you give it a rest, dude? The ship has sailed, man.
That must have been the most annoying court to be a part of. Just hanging around in the Hague as this guy's sending letters being like, hey, can I get my crown back?
Oh, just embarrassing. Very embarrassing, gentlemen.
You can really imagine Frederick V receiving news of the horrific apocalyptic sack of Magdeburg and just being like, oh, did I do that?
Oh, jeez.
Oh, boy, I really didn't hope that this would
Well
go
done. Fair play to them. I know what I'm owned.
So what is Richelieu up to here? I mean, broadly, the idea is that he can be conducting this side diplomacy because he considers Gustavus Adolphus basically a puppet that he can control.
Yes, his hope is that he can, by supporting both Maximilian's Catholic League and the Swedish Lutheran intervention, he is able to keep it so that they both check the Habsburgs while checking each other.
Right.
That's what he's hoping to be able to maintain, is a balance there. But if Gustavus is too successful, it will throw off the entire balance.
Like it really only works if all three of these poles are in equal power.
Exactly. If anybody gets the upper hand here in a significant way, it undermines his broader goals. But that's why we play the games. You got to roll the dice sometimes.
It truly is a Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
So lacking options, with his troops starving, unable to engage Gustavus directly, Tilly marches his army into Saxony. And finally, the second recalcitrant elector, John George, Old Beer George, was forced by events to take a side.
Get off the fucking fence, George.
And on September 11th, 1631, he signed a treaty with Gustavus Adolphus, allowing the Swede to enter Saxony and take command of the elector's troops, with the key provision being, quote, as long as the emergency lasts. So even in his alliance, he's trying to put an out for himself.
He's never wanting to commit too much. He just wants everyone to... Can everyone just vibe out, please? Can everyone just sit in a hall and stuff goose fat in your mouth and have a trumpet 3 feet from your face?
The giant stein of beer.
And just get shit-faced. If everyone could just get... I kind of feel like this whole time during the 30s War, John George is this... He's like he's a beer version of like a weed guy going, man, if I could just get the Emperor and Gustavus Adolphus, if I could just get them in a room and just get them fucking hammered.
We saw this whole thing out.
We could make all of this go away tomorrow.
Meanwhile, Tilly had made it to Leipzig in Saxony, and after the city initially put up resistance to his pressure for food and quarter for his troops, he was able to occupy it on September 16th. Tilly then sent his army to guard the north of the town. On September 15th, Gustavus's army of 23,000 linked with the Saxon force of 16,000 men, led by von Arman and John George himself, at Düben, and went moving south to Leipzig. The Saxon army was resplendent in fresh uniforms, while the Swedes, who had been marching themselves ragged, appeared to one observer, quote, like kitchen servants with their uncleanly rags. On September 17th, the two armies met at Breitenfeld.
The imperial force was only slightly fewer than the Protestants, 37,000 to Gustavus's 39,000. Tilly was older, cautious and patient. Pappenheim was young, daring, and impetuous. Classic situation.
Mm-hmm.
There was apparently a legend in Pappenheim's family that someday a son of their house would conquer an invading king, and perhaps Pappenheim felt that call to destiny. While scouting outside of Leipzig at Breitenfeld, Pappenheim's forces spotted the Swedes, and he sent word to Tilly that he could not safely retreat. They would have to make battle. Tilly was annoyed, felt his hand was forced, but deployed the army forward.
As soon as the Imperials were in range of the Protestants, they started an artillery bombardment of the Swedish position. The Imperials, arranged in a wide, narrow line of the now classic squares of pike and shot, the tercio formation, immediately noticed the new arrangement of Gustavus's troops. Looser squares of cavalry, checkered with smaller squares of musket formations, both much more mobile and responsive to changing battlefield conditions. Furthermore, the musketeers had been drilled in a deadly new technique. The first line would kneel so that the first two lines could fire at once. Then they would peel to the back of the group and reload while the next two lines fired. As the two sides exchanged fire for nearly 2 hours, the Swedes were able to fire their muskets at 3 to 5 times the rates of the Imperials.
Another factor increasing attrition of Imperial forces is that in this day, cannonballs did not explode upon impact. They just rolled down the battlefield, and you're essentially bowling for your enemy's troops. Now, because the tercio is a much deeper formation, during the artillery bombardment, these cannonballs could just bounce through lines and lines of Imperial troops and take them down, whereas the much more shallow and more mobile and more widely spread Swedes are able to avoid that kind of damage. Eventually, Pappenheim loses patience and ordered his cavalry to charge into the cavalry on the Swedish right. The Swedish cavalry and musket combo proved resilient, and the line held, with Pappenheim's forces charging again and again into point-blank Swedish musket fire.
Believing Pappenheim's charge to be a signal, Tilly's right flank cavalry charged the Saxon militia on the Swedish left. The militia held for a time, but they lacked the discipline of the Swedes. Soon, John George, Dear George,
God damn it.
spooked and retreated north, riding non-stop 12 miles straight to Ellenburg.
What are you good for, dude?
The Saxon line dissolved into chaos and followed, chased north by the bellowing red-cloaked Croats who led the Imperial cavalry.
Gustavus's left flank was now dangerously exposed, and though he had not ordered either charge, Tilly himself saw the opening and commanded his main mass of Imperial pike and shot tercios to sweep the Swedish left flank. But though more powerful, these tercios are achingly slow compared to the Swedish formations. So while the mass of Imperial troops crawled across the broad field to take advantage of the opening, Gustavus commanded his left side to reposition at a right angle to his main line, to basically move in, resolder a line at a 90-degree angle to where it had been in advance of the Imperial charge. That means they were able to meet Tilly's assault head on. Gustavus appeared to be everywhere, according to sources, screaming his troops along until he was hoarse, unarmored save for his billowing cloak.
Back on the Swedish right, after rebuffing 7 charges from the impetuous Pappenheim, the Swedish cavalry general Banner finally ordered a counterattack against the exhausted Imperial troops and drove them off the field and back south. Pappenheim and his men thinking only of the booty they had stored up in Leipzig and retreated back to the city. Gustavus Adolphus then appeared and personally took command of Banner's cavalry, storming them back across the field, now behind Tilly's army and to the Imperials' unguarded artillery. Gustavus seizes the artillery and, because of his combined forces, turns Tilly's own guns on the rear of Tilly's army, now engaged in a fearsome fighting with the Swedish left flank.
Remnants of the Saxon cavalry reappear for the north and join in the battery of the Imperials. Tilly's arm is now caught in a death trap. Swedish infantry and cavalry to their front, Saxons to their right, their own guns battering them from their left. Tilly knows he's lost and orders a retreat. The Imperial army flees, pursued by Swedish cavalry.
As the sun set, the thick dust cleared. 12,000 Imperial troops lay dead on the battlefield and scattered along the road back to Leipzig. All 20 Imperial cannons were captured. 7,000 Imperial troops had been captured, and after some short contract negotiations, they were now Swedish troops. Tilly himself was wounded in the neck and had his arm shattered. After 12 years of conflict, the Protestant forces had finally scored a W.
The first Battle of Breitenfeld, spoiler alert, sorry, yes, it's the first Battle of Breitenfeld, is the bass drop in the EDM song that is the 30 Years' War. Any remaining skepticism about Gustavus's ability or intentions among Germany's Protestant worthies evaporated as the news spread. The victory had been so complete that some speculated that the Swedes wouldn't stop until they'd plundered Rome and clapped the Pope in irons. Protestant preachers in the pay of the king walked the countryside in advance of the Swedish army, rhapsodizing in village squares and taverns about this Lion of the North and his holy army. Catholics saw in him the embodiment of doom, as the Jesuit order, in the words of the Swedish intelligentsia, comforted their credulous novices with his being Antichrist, and that he should reign 3 years and a half and no longer. It's like, don't worry, guys. Yes, He's kicking our asses. But he's the Antichrist, so 3.5 years.
Which I'm sure is based on some kind of bizarre biblical numerology.
Yes, of course. As we see here. Tilly led the remnants of his army west into Westphalia to meet up with reinforcements, allowing Gustavus to pick up local German auxiliaries as his forces relentlessly marched southwest along the course of the River Main. In November, Gustavus marched triumphantly into Frankfurt, which observers noted he was now in this very same room where the emperors at their coronation used to be entertained. There may be a sign of good luck in that, and perchance this may not be the last time that he shall there be seated. By December, Heidelberg, the capital of the Palatinate, the capital of Reformed Protestantism, where this whole bloody disaster had first been conceived of by a coven of alchemists, religious fanatics, and opportunists, was in Swedish hands. In April 1632, the Swedish army met the Imperials at Rhein and drove them off, killing Tilly with an arquebus, or maybe cannon blast, that shattered his thigh. R.I.P., he was 73.
Now, Tilly was a career
Yes.
army guy. He had been on horseback
His entire
50
adult
years.
life.
Can you imagine, 50 years, being 73, sleeping in 17th century
sleeping in
tents,
tents. He's
on
been riding a
horseback
horse every day
10
of his
hours
life.
a day,
He's into his 70s he's doing this.
and
just bouncing around and having to deal with all these dumb, water-headed nobles writing him letters, telling him to be somewhere, telling him they can't pay him, they can't keep the troops in the field, telling him he's got to go, oh, well, figure it out. Find the money somewhere.
all to take an arquebus to the leg and just die.
And just get lead out on the battlefield. Yeah.
Rip to Tilly.
A rip to Tilly. He was a real one. Shortly afterward, the Swedes captured that famous city that we all love to name things after, Augsburg. The town's evangelical citizens opened the doors to Gustavus in the face of their Catholic city council and greeted the king to a hero's welcome. Broadsheets commemorating the day were published soon after. A Catholic priest in the city noted that the Protestant population treated the king and his troops as God's angel and their redeemers. But the cost of buffing up city defenses and quartering Swedish garrisons would soon test the patience of even the most enthusiastic Protestant burgher.
Yes. We're all happy. We're all happy that
We're
this
ordering
God's
apps.
herald on earth has arrived in the city until somebody has to front the check.
Exactly. We love ordering the apps. We don't love splitting up afterwards.
Yes.
On May 17th, 1632, Gustavus entered Maximilian of Bavaria's capital city of Munich, with poor old Frederick V tagging along in his coattails. That's right. He blew all the way into the heartland of Catholic Germany. He only stayed 10 days, long enough to strip the city of anything of value, while his troops contended with a guerrilla campaign by Catholic peasants resisting Swedish raiding parties. Now, let's step back for a second here. So as he's leaving Munich, we have seen in 10 months, Gustavus lead an army on a 500-mile path of conquest in a diagonal line from the northeast Baltic shore of Pomerania to the southwestern Black Forests of Bavaria. A small Swedish army had broken off and taken Mecklenburg along the Baltic to the west of Pomerania. So you have this diagonal swath and this this Baltic beachhead commanded within 10 months in a war that had been fought dulcitorily for over a decade with no accumulated advantage other than just the slow erosion of Protestant forces. Along the way, Gustavus claimed all German lands as Swedish fiefs to be sequestered by the king upon the death of their current sovereigns, just like poor old Duke of Pomerania. So in the process, he had finally turned the German conflict into a truly continental contest, with a formal alliance of Sweden and the major German princes, supported financially and diplomatically by France, Britain, and the Dutch Republic, arrayed against the Emperor, the Catholic League, and Habsburg Spain.
Okay, so while we're taking stock, let's look at some of these other players in this game right now.
Yeah.
So first, let's back up a bit and look at France. Even as Cardinal Richelieu was busy planting the seeds of a new Protestant alliance with the Swedes and Germany, he was dealing with his own religious conflict at home. Tensions between the Huguenot Protestants and the royal government had grown throughout the 1620s, and in 1627, when a fleet of English ships attempted to reinforce the Huguenot positions on the Atlantic coast, the situation erupted into a full-on revolt. The Huguenot rebellion created some strange bedfellows in the midst of the 30 Years' War, with the English attempting to relieve the Huguenots and France pursuing an alliance with Spain against the Protestant coalition, while renting the ships from the Dutch, who were also receiving French support in their war with the Spanish. This all climaxes with the dramatic Siege of La Rochelle, the fortified Huguenot stronghold. La Rochelle held out for over a year against the royal siege, sometimes under the personal command of Richelieu. But in 1628, the city surrendered. Its population had dwindled from over 25,000 to 5,000 from the months of brutal deprivation.
Richelieu's campaign against the Huguenots was a masterful exercise in slow rolling. Careful not to violate the letter of the Edict of Nantes, Richelieu nonetheless carried out a series of provocations that had the effect of rousing Huguenot resistance, providing a pretext for their eventual suppression. Once the Huguenot forces were bottled up in La Rochelle, royal troops, in an astounding feat of engineering and under the watchful eye of Richelieu, who patrolled the beaches in a buff coat and boots, built a seawall nearly a mile long to cut off the city from amphibious resupply. Although the Edict of Nantes wasn't rescinded until 1685, the fall of La Rochelle meant the effective end of the Huguenots as an independent military and political force in France. This is only part of Richelieu's grand strategy to enlarge the authority and capacity of the French state. In addition, he seated the Parisian court with his creatures, men who owed their positions and therefore loyalty to the cardinal and no one else. Richelieu also sold provincial offices to the highest bidder, with a yearly fee required to retain a hereditary right to the post. Now, this raised revenue for the crown while keeping the aristocracy, ever suspicious of the enlargement of royal authority, competing with each other for these lucrative sinecures. Occasionally, he would create an office, accept payment to fill it, then abolish the office. A less dramatic version of the old papal practice of selling a venal office and then poisoning the purchaser. The policy of raising state revenues by selling venal offices would end up significantly hampering France's ability to compete with her new neighbors in the coming centuries. But at this point, it was a handy addition to Richelieu's Machiavellian toolbook.
And just an aside on Richelieu, he had some of the best fits of this period.
He is a drip king. There's no denying
the
it.
cardinal, like, religious garb with like a military breastplate and like soldier's boots.
Yeah, he would.
That's a real strong look.
It was like those are, you're taking all the best traditions of finery and bringing them together in one man. The martial, the spiritual, and then the aristocratic. It's all in one glorious package.
So while all this was happening, France was also fighting another protracted conflict in Italy. The War of Mantuan Succession, which is another one of those classic high school history test buzzwords.
Yeah, you got your Mantuan succession, you got your Austrian succession,
Yes,
there's
of
Spanish
course.
succession, and there's somewhere.
We don't really need to get too much into the War of Mantuan Succession. It's another one of these things that we've talked about that where, they're just fighting a dynastic dispute in northern Italy over these rich city-states.
Would they be allied to Spain or France?
Yes, exactly. This one results in France and Spain fighting for control over the same area they're always fighting over, the key Italian positions on the Spanish roads that the Habsburgs relied on to move troops and goods up into the Netherlands. The result is, after pouring huge amounts of military resources and wealth into the conflict, the Spanish make no substantial gains, creating huge disturbances in their operations in the Netherlands and affecting their ability to reinforce their Austrian cousins.
The Mantuan War illustrates just how challenging a position the Habsburgs in Spain and Austria were in. They're treated by their enemies as a single power, but they were never able to effectively coordinate their policies or strategies because they could not coordinate their interests. One of the things that hampered imperial efforts to crush the Danes and secure the Baltic was the diversion of 30,000 troops to Italy in 1630. Wallenstein had begged Ferdinand not to send them, and all they ended up doing was bringing bubonic plague, which sparked an outbreak that killed 35% of the population of northern Italy by the end of the next year. The death toll in the besieged city of Mantua itself was over 70%. The result critically weakened both Spain and Austria, deepened papal hostility to the Habsburgs, and hastened the ascension of France as the dominant power in Europe.
Yes, I believe it's in the Wedgwood there. It says something like that Ferdinand could have perhaps achieved some sort of dominance, but he had to drag the corpse of Spain along with him.
Yes.
But this corpse is
It's
full of
the
money.
boy.
It's full of silver.
It's full of silver. It's just getting it out. It's like you're banging on this thing to try to get the fucking money out of it, but it's because its internal structures are insufficient to the task of rendering their accessible revenue into real productive force.
And I'm always banging on this, but it's just looking at here, we're seeing all these different ingredients of how to build a state. Richelieu with his bureaucratic absolutism,
Yep.
Gustavus with his military command state, the Dutch with their merchant republic, Ferdinand with a Catholicized empire.
Yeah.
They all have one tool, but you need
Yep.
to put it all together
Yep.
to get a functional state.
Yeah, the Habsburgs more than anything, yes, they have tapped into New World resources and changed the game at like a basic level. Like they broke through like scarcity constraints there, but that's all they can do. They have otherwise an antiquated and sclerotic structure, and nobody else has anything that can touch that. But they have something else that they lack, another thing, and so they just fight against each other frantically because of the crisis conditions that they are having to accommodate. But they cannot. None can come to the top yet, because none of these ingredients have yet cohered in one polity.
Exactly.
Foreshadowing. So what made Richelieu's strategy all the more remarkable is that he accomplished all of this under the constant threat of being removed from power at any moment and executed. During this period, the cardinal's hold on young Louis XIII was strong, but just as strong was the hatred of the spurned Queen Mother, Maria de' Medici, who had been Richelieu's original patron,
Right.
and who he had turned on. He had originally been a devote. He had been one of the Spanish sympathized Catholic party, and then seeing where the turn was coming, switched over to the politique side. So she hates him as a traitor, as does her younger son, Gaston. So Louis at this point has not fathered a son, and that means that Gaston, his younger brother, is the heir to the throne.
Some real House of the Dragon shit
And
here.
this is some Gambo. So Marie and Gaston had that devout faction in the French court that wanted a holy alliance with Spain against the Protestant heretics and pressed for a resolution to the Mantuan War at that Diet of Regensburg.
Where Wallenstein got fired.
Right. If the frequently ill Louis died, that's the other thing. He's one of these. He's not one of the robust guys. He's one of the little coughing guys. If the frequently ill Louis died, Richelieu would be dismissed, at least, probably executed, and French foreign policy reoriented towards Spain.
Right.
Now all this conflict came to the head on the Day of the Dupes.
Great day. Great name for a day.
November of 1630, when the Queen Mother confronted her son and the Cardinal in his chambers, demanding that Louis choose between the two once and for all. Louis gave no answer and fled to his hunting lodge. Now Richelieu, Marie, and the rest of court all assumed that this was the end of the Cardinal. With his enemies gathering to celebrate in the Luxembourg Palace, Richelieu traveled to the King's hunting palace to face the music. There, Louis reaffirmed his commitment to the Cardinal and his policy. Richelieu's court enemies were arrested, the Queen Mother was exiled, and the Regensburg Treaty was abrogated. It was either another example of the king's fecklessness, or Louis basically invented the prank show genre here. Spain was forced to agree to peace on less favorable terms in Mantua, and the Cardinal was free to pursue his alliance with Protestant Sweden. Although that policy didn't look as sound a year later, with Gustavus Adolphus the master of Germany and capable of posing his own threat to French supremacy.
It's kind of like a bachelor rose ceremony, but just deciding who gets exiled or executed.
Yep.
All the cuts, the dramatic music, and King Louis XIII, like, I've made a decision.
Yep. You could look at this as a moment where, like, this is like a real hinge point of history, because it just comes down to this guy's decision.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been the end of Richelieu if he had wanted it to be. Why not? And I think it comes down to he wanted to be king, and Richelieu had a vision of how he could govern as a king. The devout faction at the end in that moment of time is asking the kingdom to be devolved, basically.
Right.
To the power devolved away to some abstract papacy and to the fucking nobility and away from the dynasty.
Plus, Richelieu was just a Chad. And
He was a Chad, and
I imagine he was
he's
very convincing.
Honeyed words, and he looked so good.
Yes.
How are you going to say no to a man dripped out?
So speaking of the Spanish, the war in the Netherlands had gone hot and taken a turn. And very sorry, but I've got some tough words coming up here, so we'll see how I do. In 1629, Dutch forces were able to lay siege and eventually take the city of Sergotenbusch?
I think it's Sergotenbusch.
It's the name of the city starts with an apostrophe.
Apostrophe. The first letter in the name is an apostrophe.
It's an apostrophe S dash
Small s.
small s dash
Dash, then large H.
Hergotenbusch.
Hergotenbusch.
I'm going to call this Sergotenbusch.
Sergotenbusch.
And I include the name of the city basically to make myself try to pronounce it.
Good luck. That was good. I think we got there.
Sergettenbush.
Sergettenbush.
The city was
Sergettenbush. Call me Sergettenbush.
The city was considered impregnable. It was the main base of Spanish operations in the United Provinces, and loyal to the Spanish for decades. Its capture was seen as a major black eye for the Spanish and a turning point in the conflict. And also interesting here, the siege was apparently a bit of a European tourist destination because of the ingenuity for which it was conducted. Military-minded nobles from across the continent were coming to admire and learn from Frederick Henry, who is the military commander of the Dutch United Forces' novel methods, which included, of course, building a series of dikes and pump systems.
They're Dutch, folks.
Yes, they've got one move.
They're the dozers from Fraggle Rock.
Yes.
You get them together, they're going to start building a dike. They're going to start building a canal.
So we built a series of dikes and pump systems to drain the water from the town's civil defenses.
Wild.
And also present there, a bunch of guys who are going to be players later in our story in the English Civil War, with the guys like Thomas Fairfax and Jacob Astley just hanging around watching these dikes get built.
You know, we've been making some fun of these Calvinists on this show, but just think about that. You've literally reversed the course of water. You have done what Moses did. Mm-hmm. You've parted waters just by your mutual action.
Yes.
Your coordinated effort has done this, has wrought a miracle. Of course you are the elect. How could you not be? Look what you're capable of. Look at works you're capable of.
The Dutch were rallying civic militias and fielding massive armies at this point, sometimes reaching over 120,000 men mobilized, which is insane considering the Netherlands. It's an area the size of, like, Maryland in the 17th century to field 120,000 men. Stadtholder Prince Frederick Henry of Orange,
the successor of Maurice.
Yes. The commander of the Dutch forces pressed the advantage, and by summer 1632, with his successful siege of Maastricht, had pushed the Spanish basically back into the Spanish Netherlands, a.k.a. Belgium.
So basically the entire war since the end of the truce is a waste of time.
Right.
Those were natural borders, basically.
At this point, there was a push for peace negotiations, which went nowhere. And if you remember the Remonstrance Arminians debate from a few episodes ago, well, here it is again. Matt.
So the Dutch East India Company had been established, we talked about it, to manage the risks of the various Indonesian, Southeast Asian, and Indian trade networks that had at that point been funded by these cartels of urban merchants, concentrated in the commercial capital of Amsterdam. The East India Company brought these disparate projects under one corporate umbrella and administration. It would minimize risk and raise funds through the sale of stock certificates to private investors. This company, of course, was an arm of the nascent Dutch Republic, which was politically dominated by the regents, the same urban merchant grandees who owned controlling stock in the East India Company. The aim of the state and the aim of capital are in alignment, and that is to extend Dutch control over Asians' trade routes, using the profits reaped to fund a holy war to liberate the entire Netherlands from the Jesuitical Spanish yoke and make even more money doing it, stacking those guilders, son. But there were urban burghers, many from the smaller, less influential cities outside of Holland, who were left out of the patronage networks that gathered around the East India Company stockholders and had an interest at trying their hand at extending Dutch trade networks to the Caribbean. However, at this point, the Caribbean is largely a Spanish lagoon, and the expense of competing with the Spanish there was more than the penny-pinching Amsterdam regents were willing to bear. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, remember him?
Yes.
The official who represented Amsterdam business interests on the diplomatic stage, agreed as part of the 12 years truce to restrict Dutch trade and shipping in the Caribbean. But when Oldenbarnevelt was beheaded in a quasi-military coup by Maurice of Nassau's war party, which was headed in the cities by rivals to Amsterdam, it meant the war would recommence, and with it, Dutch colonization efforts in the Americas. So, in 1621, same year the 12 years truce expired, the Dutch West India Company was chartered, using the same basic corporate governance structure as the East India Company, with board seats reserved for set numbers of representatives from the different regions of the Netherlands. Amsterdam still had the most seats. The balance of interest on the board was dominated by the young money hustlers from the surrounding provinces. East India Company ships settled colonies and established trading networks from the Hudson River Valley in North America to Brazil in the south.
And hey, this is where New Amsterdam gets its start.
This is where New Amsterdam shows up.
Good old New York.
Good old New York was New Amsterdam, as well as outposts in western and southern Africa. They also engaged in an aggressive privateering campaign against Spanish treasure and trade ships in the Caribbean. This piracy war climaxed with the Battle of Matanza Bay in 1628, which saw a Dutch privateer squadron capture the entire 31-ship Spanish silver fleet that held the entire year's tribute from the colonies to the crown in Madrid. They snatched the entire bag.
Yes.
The Dutch seized over 11 million guilders and other valuable trade goods and used the proceeds to pay the Dutch army that finally took the city of Herstbottenbush. Remember that guy?
Yes.
They only were able to keep those guys in the trenches by giving them Spain's own goddamn silver.
And you're like, if you're the Spanish general there, you're like, they're paying their guys with our money? Oh,
just
God.
the brutalest about. It's like, this is a machine that works fighting one that is breaking down.
Exactly.
Nevertheless, the cost of fighting the war drained the company coffers and provided scant return to the investors back home, which helped return the political initiative to the Peace Party in Amsterdam. The network of colonies, trading posts, and supply chains built by the West India Company became the triangle trade infrastructure that would in time form the material base for the entire political economy of the Atlantic world.
And which we're still basically living in the shadow of. This is what we're trying to tell you, folks.
This is where the bones of the this is where the bones are being forged.
When that guy comes back to life in Hellraiser,
yes,
when the blood and sinew drift up from the boards, that's what we're seeing happen of the way the modern political economy works.
It is stuff moving from Europe to Africa to the Americas,
and then back.
That is going to build all of our institutions. And the way that capitalism unfolds is determined by that relationship.
And it's happening all right here with these goofy Dutch guys building dikes around Sir Gottenbush.
Yep, just so that they can beat the Spanish.
Yes.
We're not trying to do that. We're not trying to build a capitalist god that we're going to worship and destroy the world with. We just want to get the Spanish out of here.
Yes.
So that we can all worship as we see fit.
Of course.
We can live in accordance with our values. And who doesn't want that?
It's on its face a noble pursuit.
Yep. So all the while, the politics of the Republic revolved not around these questions of corporate competition, but around more emotive issues, such as the prosecution of the war and the precise nature of God's grace.
Always arguing about it.
Yes. At the same time that the Dutch are inventing the modern slave trade with their string of trade forts along the West African coast, where prisoners of native wars were traded for firearms and sundries, then shipped across the Atlantic to be worked to death, clearing the jungles and swamps of the Americas. They were also engaging in refined debates about the destination of their souls. They're figuring out who are the good guys and how to find them. The Armenians, though defeated at Dort, remember Dort?
The Synod of Dort.
They got defeated. They got BTFO at the Synod of Dort. They were still protesting that a God who created men just to condemn them was a child burning ants with a magnifying glass. Meanwhile, the Orthodox Calvinists insist that God's conception of righteousness was as distinct and distant from fallen man's puny ideas of the good and could only be faintly glimpsed in the unfolding of nature. Now, both of these conceptions of God are based on an immaculate chain of logic spelled out in academic volumes, popular pamphlets, church sermons, and family table talks across the United Provinces. With the end of Catholic ritual life, the physical sensation of working a rosary was replaced with the mental action of working out the path of one's salvation, of reaching out to know the mind of God through reasoning towards him. The greatest aid in that work is the evidence of the senses, not senses as in bestowers of pleasure, but senses as objective recorders of reality. The Orthodox Calvinists affirm that we can use our senses to confirm just who amongst us God has chosen to bestow his earthly blessings to. So these gumorous Calvinists ruled in the grim ranks of the Dutch army, in the cabins of slave ships and on plantation verandas. In the more serene counting houses of Amsterdam, however, where the grubby business of capital accumulation is sterilized into a collection of inert numbers on paper, religious life began to turn away from the legacy of Calvin. Non-conforming religious dissidents thrived in the gap between church and state created by the Calvinist social model of congregational autonomy. This was often a Christianity based less on mentally tabulating and comparing levels of sin than on mystical experience, charity, and a politics of social uplift. It was this permissive Dutch religious culture that the English Puritan refugees, collectively traumatized by the relentless blasphemies and repressions of the English Anglican Church, fled to North America in order to escape.
It's all happening. It's all
coming together,
it's all
baby.
coming together
And
right
it's
here.
all-
This is why we did this series.
And what's stopping it from slowing down, what's allowing it to emerge, is Spain cannot stop this.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk more about Spain next episode. We won't. This episode's already pretty long. We'll talk more about where Spain is. Suffice it to say that Olivares' attempt to impose some sort of centralizing state-building discipline on the Spanish war effort fails apart in the face of regional revolts and resistance from the autonomous powers in the various regions of the Spanish Empire, both in the colonies and in Iberia.
So, back to Germany. Spring into summer 1632. Gustavus Adolphus' name was preached and sung across Protestant Germany. He had maybe 80,000 men under his command throughout the country as the various dukes, regents, landgraves, and margraves of the lesser principalities swore oath to him. As he had driven to Munich, he cajoled John George to take his Saxon army into Bohemia. Though most had expected Gustavus to take Bohemia himself after Breitenfeld and push straight to Vienna, Gustavus reasoned, probably accurately given the guy's track record, he could not trust John George's loyalty in holding central Germany, which is a fair
hoe
belt.
ain't loyal.
Yes. As soon as you get him out of your sight, he's going to go back to the beer hall and say, I'm done with all of this.
Yep.
Yes. And so if he made the elector invade the imperial lands of Bohemia, then John George's die would be cast irrevocably with the Swedes. And there was another enticement. Albrecht Wallenstein, remember him, had generously offered to simply cede Prague to the Protestant forces. And on November 15th, 1631, the Saxon army under Van Arman had taken Prague without a fight.
Protestants in Prague again.
Protestants in
They're
Prague.
back,
It's
baby.
back.
They did it.
Wallenstein. It turns out his petulant patience had been the right strategy. The Habsburgs were, at this moment, properly fucked. Spain was locked out of the Netherlands by the Dutch naval victories and the closing of the Spanish road by Gustavus's conquests, and its treasury nearly depleted from the Dutch simply taking a year's worth
They're
of
taking
silver.
my jack, and they're getting less and less from the colonies, which are growing more and more independent of them.
Ferdinand was bottled up in his imperial holdings, and with no funds from his Spanish cousins, there was just one guy he could turn to. Through November and December 1631, the emperor sent a series of letters to Wallenstein, some written in his own hand, pleading the general to retake his post and resume funding the imperial cause, and eventually sent a delegation to Wallenstein not so much to negotiate terms, but simply to ask the general what he wanted. And on the last day of 1631, Wallenstein relented and said he would raise an army by the following March.
So Gustavus's smashing victories had scared Maximilian fully back into the arms of the emperor, and he agreed to submit the remaining pieces of the Catholic League army to Wallenstein's overall command. With Count Tilly dead, there was no serious competitor for power at the top of the new imperial army, which took rapid shape as Wallenstein, given access to the revenues of the Habsburg imperial lands, activated huge numbers of veterans who had been at loose ends since their demobilization. The cold weather, as well as the deprivations and plagues spread by the marauding armies, had destroyed significant parts of Germany's rural and urban economy. Many veterans were willing to sign up for half the bonus money they had received upon their first enlistment. Wallenstein's forces gathered in the south, while Pappenheim brought together the tattered remnants of the League and Imperial armies in the northwest. Wallenstein had leveraged the emperor's desperation to secure for himself total military and diplomatic authority over the war effort, answerable only to Ferdinand himself. He had the right to issue patents to military recruiters and to appoint officers. The emperor retained to himself the right to grant promotion. While Wallenstein had fewer allies at court in Vienna than he had before his dismissal, he made up for this by recruiting a tight-knit group of senior officers to surround himself with, securing their loyalty with the distribution of plundered treasuries and estates. His chief aide was his son-in-law, Adam Erdmann Tricht von Lippe. Perhaps this time Wallenstein could build sufficient independent power to neutralize opposition from the electors or the emperor himself. Perhaps God favored the venture. He could leverage his position between the emperor and Gustavus to secure himself an independent political power base, maybe even the imperial crown. So he is now building a military machine, reactivating the network that he had built at the first place, that is now going to create a material base to a war economy.
I kind of think of, at this phase, Wallenstein as kind of like Saruman in the Two Towers, turning Isengard into the orc factory.
Yes.
That he has turned his lands into this like perfect military machine. His duchy of Friedland that he'd created for himself, whole cloth out of Bohemia, had become just one vast magazine for supplying food, clothing, all the stores needed to power these roving music festival armies.
Yeah.
He had sponsored the creation of munition factories and mills he had grinding night and day on 24-hour shifts. Bakers baking hundreds of thousands of loaves, brewers brewing, weavers weaving. He had built a fully military society.
Yes, which was fully committed to the purpose of war, but also vulnerable because, like all war-based economies, it is parasitical.
Mm-hmm.
And it does not have the same social embeddedness that even the remote emperor does. And we'll see that play out.
So we just mentioned that Wallenstein at this time, he was writing letters where it was said that the words were escaping his mouth that perhaps the imperial crown might pass from the Habsburgs to himself. Well, hell, even Adolphus himself was musing aloud about the possibility of wearing the imperial crown. With the electors refusing to crown Ferdinand's son, Ferdinand, King of the Romans, back in 1630 at Regensburg, continued Habsburg claim of the title Holy Roman Empire seemed, at this moment, weak enough to at least be questioned.
Come on, what do you think, guys? Gustavus Adolphus?
Holy Roman Emperor?
What do you
Got
think?
a ring to it.
Got a
Emperor
ring to
Adolphus?
it. It's just we reorient northern, it works.
Yeah, come on. Look what all I've got.
Look at my shit.
Look at all my shit.
Look at my Vasa. Don't look at the
my
Vasa.
shit.
Never mind. Don't look at the Vasa.
Wallenstein's first move was basically to politely ask John George to evacuate Saxony, which he did.
Of course.
These electors ain't loyal. By May 25th, 1632, Wallenstein was back in command at Prague as Count Thurn, always wandering
Count
around
Thurn.
there, who was in command of the Swedish regiment attached to the Saxons, reported back to Gustavus. Gustavus retreated north to Nuremberg, and Wallenstein marched west, meeting up with the Elector Maximilian's Catholic army on the frontier of Bavaria and Bohemia. Wallenstein was able to trap Gustavus at Nuremberg, forcing the king's army to languish under harsh conditions. As much as 75% of his cavalry perished in the siege. Gustavus attempts to break out of the siege at the costly but indecisive Battle of Fürth in early September. The Swedes finally broke out to the south, giving Wallenstein the opportunity to move north into Saxony, where he hoped to intimidate John George out of the conflict and lure Gustavus away from moving on to Vienna. The plan worked, and Gustavus raced after him. And on November 16th, the two great generals and their armies met outside Leipzig at the small town of Lutzen.
Wallenstein arranged his 15,000-man army in the standard fashion. Artillery in front, infantry in the middle, cavalry on either side, on the north side of the road from Lutzen to Leipzig, with the town of Lutzen to the imperial right, the Swedish left. He also crucially placed a line of musketeers in the ditch to the north of the road to cover any Swedish charge.
Gustavus had the numerical advantage of 18,000 men, which he arranged in the Swedish fashion to the south of the road. Gustavus personally stood before his whole army to lead them in prayer in the morning, after the enemy had already begun firing. After trading artillery for several hours, the king led his right cavalry to charge the imperial left, and after heavy skirmishing in the front, was able to oust the musketeers from the ditch.
On the other side, Wallenstein had his army set fire to the town of Lutzen, and soon a heavy black smoke enveloped the battlefield. Wallenstein then ordered the imperial Croatian cavalry on his right to charge under the cover of smoke, crashing into the Swedish left. But the Swedes, commanded by Bernard Saxe-Weimar, held their position as murky, smoky chaos overtook the field.
In this chaos, at some point, Pappenheim arrived and reinforced the imperial left's cavalry, driving the Swedes back across the road they had won earlier. Pappenheim took a musket ball to the lung and would die choking on his own blood while lying in a coach on the way back to Leipzig, a blood-stained copy of Wallenstein's orders in his pocket.
This is the orders that Wallenstein had given him to get him to the battlefield. The enemy is marching in this direction. The Lord Leave everything standing and lying and make your way here with all men and cannons so that he can be here with us early tomorrow morning. I, however, remain wherein. And then he says, P.S. He, the enemy, is already at the pass where yesterday there was the bad road. And on the back of the envelope he wrote in Latin, Cito, cito, citissime, cito. Quick, quick, very quick, quick. And he did. He got there, and then he took a bullet.
And apparently you can still see that letter in Vienna?
Yeah. It's R.I.P. Pappenheim.
You got to dispatch the goon before you get to the main guy.
Exactly.
Gustavus Adolphus, the king who believed the ship that carries him cannot sink, rode into the smoke of the Swedish left flank and urged his men forward. But only his horse was seen riding out of the smoke cloud. Somewhere in the smoke, the king had been killed. As rumor without confirmation of the king's demise began to spread the field, Bernhard Saxe-Weimar rallied the Swedish left and drove the imperial cavalry back into the flames of Lutzen. The Swedish right also rallied, retook the road, and drove Pappenheim's forces off the field. Wallenstein had lost command of the field and retreated at nightfall north to Halle in an embarrassing tactical defeat, but a shattering strategic victory. Gustavus Adolphus's body was eventually found, nude, under a pile of corpses in the ditch on the imperial side of the road. He had been stabbed, shot twice in the arm, once in the side, once in the back, and the killing shot in his right temple. The Swedish camp celebrated their victory in silence.
It took some time for the news of the king's death to spread. In a letter written the day after the battle, Wallenstein could only vouch, after reporting the death of Pappenheim, that they say that the king is also dead. He took pains to note as well that while he chose to retire from the field first, I have received from the enemy more than 30 standards and flags. He no more than 5 or most 6 from me. But soon enough, the reality of Adolphus' death began to sink in. In less than 3 years, Gustavus had taken Sweden from the frozen periphery of Europe to the heart of continental power. A devastating series of battlefield victories and territorial conquest had seen Gustavus outgrow his alliance with France, gaining the potential ability to redraw the map of the Holy Roman Empire, taking its capital from Vienna to Stockholm. This obviously caused great anxiety in Paris, where Richelieu's policy of financial subsidy for the Swedes threatened to turn Gustavus into the effective head of a military and diplomatic alliance of Protestant nations that would be able to fatally check French ambitions for continental hegemony. The old iron law of unintended consequences. But fortunately for the cardinal, Gustavus died at Lutzen, and with him stopped the beating heart of the Swedish war machine. The throne passed to his 8-year-old daughter Christina and was held in regency by Chancellor Oxenstierna, who took over command of the Swedish army. But nerdy little Axel is no Gustavus, and the Swedish military intervention immediately began to lose purpose and cohesion. To prop up the Protestant side, France would soon be forced to give up its pose of interested neutrality and formally enter the war. This post-Gustavus period is held in German memory as the darkest, most savage, and miserable years of the conflict. Now, this perception underestimates just how much darkness, savagery, and misery had been suffered and inflicted in the first part of the war, but it is undeniable that after more than a decade of ravening armies marching in every direction, the social and economic cohesion of the affected German lands was beginning to seriously fray. It's also true that with the grand designs of Ferdinand and the Swedes coming apart, the strategic logic of the war gave way to a policy of pure attrition, with the Spanish and Imperials competing with the Franco-Swedish alliance to keep their armies on their opponent's territory as long as possible, tearing through each other's agricultural surplus like locusts to make the enemy sue for peace to save their grain. Senior officers on both sides embraced the cynical spirit of the age and leveraged their command to extort lands and positions from the highest bidder, while stripping the towns and villages they encountered of anything valuable. These were years that would be remembered for generations as a time of rape, torture, robbery, and murder of peasants by soldiers, as well as spasms of bloody vengeance visited by peasants upon soldiers, a time of plague outbreaks and witch hysteria, crop failures and starvation, all churned into being by the ceaseless trudge of armies across the ravaged center of Germany. The first 3 horsemen of the apocalypse were on their wild hunt. The people, hiding from cavalry patrols in freezing forests, awaited the arrival of the 4th horseman, the pale rider of death, the only deliverance remaining to be sought.
And yet, there was one man who still had the resources, the authority, the vision, and the will to pursue a policy of total victory. Albrecht Wallenstein was still in the field, still commanded the most viable force in the empire, if not the continent, still with his eyes on the prize. Gustavus Adolphus had said that no ship that carried him could sink, then foundered like the Great Vasa. And now it was time for Count Wallenstein to build his own ship of destiny. Hell on Earth is written by Matt Christman and Chris Wade. It's produced by me, Chris Wade, with editing from our co-producer, Nick Quaz. Show art and animation is from the great Ben Clarkson, and you can find a supplemental interactive atlas for the series by John White over at hellonearth.chapotraphouse.com. Our theme music is by Nick Diamonds, with additional music by Alessandro Takeshi, The Great Varelli, John Ahrens, Tyrant King, Frederick Scarfoni, and Austin Riley. Join us next week as we finally go to hell. It's February 25th, 1634, and Albrecht Wallenstein and his core group of generals are staying in the town of Eger on the Bohemian-Bavarian border. 15 months had passed since the Battle of Lutzen. And though that battle ended with Swedish victory, the death of their king had collapsed the momentum of their campaign. The war had again settled into a vicious stalemate. Wallenstein remained the key military commander on the imperial side, though much had changed for him as well. Beset by illness, his once unparalleled mastery of logistics had begun to falter, and his belief in astrology, once a hobbyist's fascination, was now his main tool in decision-making.
Wallenstein and his generals were met at Eger by Walter Butler, the commander in charge of a company of Irish and Scots soldiers under the command of Octavio Pigolomini, the Italian mercenary who had taken Pappenheim's place in the imperial army after his death. The Irishman invited Wallenstein's generals, Illo, Kinsky, Tricka, and Niemann, to dinner at the city's castle. The generals obliged, though Wallenstein himself stayed at his lodgings near the town square. The group of imperial generals at the castle wined and dined, discussed campaigning plans, gossiped about various alliances, until, with a nod between Walter Butler and one of his servants, 6 dragoons rushed into the room, all yelling, "Who's a good imperialist?" The Irish mercenaries stood and declared, "Long live Ferdinand!" And with that, Wallenstein's men were beaten, bludgeoned, and stabbed to a sudden and bloody death.
At 10 p.m., Irish Captain Walter Devereux opened the door to Wallenstein's chambers. Wallenstein turned from the window, his boots, sword, and coat off, a frail old man preparing for bed. And, as he muttered something that may have been a plea for quarter, Captain Devereux ran Albrecht Wallenstein through with a halberd. The greatest general left standing in the 30 Years' War, perhaps the only one able to conceive or achieve some sort of conclusion to the conflict, was dead. They rolled him up in a carpet and dragged his body away. There would be 14 more years of war to go.
Wallenstein's downfall was a tragedy of hubris. Practically since the moment he resumed command of the Imperial Army, he'd been conducting his own private diplomatic negotiations with the Emperor's enemies. Though Wallenstein was a military man first and foremost, his ambitions drew his eyes beyond the limits of the battlefield. The Emperor had brought him back after First Breitenfeld to save him from the Swedes, and that Wallenstein had accomplished. But the Emperor's refusal to make peace required a total victory over Sweden and German Protestantism that Wallenstein, being closer to the quickened pulse of the commercial world, knew could not be won. This gap in understanding could be leveraged to Wallenstein's advantage. If Ferdinand refused to make peace when it was clear that a military victory was impossible, Wallenstein would force peace upon him, thereby putting Wallenstein in the cockpit of German power. There were secret communications to the French, the Swedes, and the Protestant princes. Wallenstein also kept in contact with the commanders of the forces opposing him in the field to minimize unnecessary conflict while he brokered his own settlement. Wallenstein's visions were grand and somewhat whimsical. To a French ambassador, he suggested that the war could end with a unifying crusade against the Turks, which is something that the Pope had sort of hoped for at the beginning of the conflict. There were also notions of a vast, independent Central European state under Wallenstein's control. Failing that, the complete reduction of Habsburg power. Anything, in other words, to end the bloodshed and allow Germany to rebuild. After Lutzen, Wallenstein's refusal to engage with Swedish forces and the whisperings of his enemies in the army that the Generalissimo was telling anyone who would listen that the emperor was too powerfully under the sway of Jesuits to make a just peace, convinced Ferdinand that Wallenstein was a traitor. He was aware of the movement against him, but felt confident that his control of the army was strong enough to deter the emperor from action, or if the emperor did act, his commanders would support him in any conflict. He was wrong. The Wallenstein war machine was formidable, but it was still essentially a parasite on the Holy Roman Empire. The bulk of Wallenstein's officers saw the emperor as a more reliable meal ticket than their increasingly isolated field commander, and it was this lack of support in the ranks that sealed Wallenstein's fate. While Wallenstein might have known more of the conditions of Germany than the emperor did, he couldn't see into the hearts of men, no matter how many horoscopes he commissioned. In the early days of 1634 in Vienna, the emperor arranged a secret trial, which convicted Wallenstein of treason. An imperial declaration of his dismissal from command, his official status as a traitor to the empire, and an order for his arrest was published in Prague on February 18th. It was while attempting to reach the safety of Swedish lines that Wallenstein and his most trusted subordinates stopped for rest in Eger to enjoy the hospitality of the local garrison. The garrison was loyal to Piccolomini, and Piccolomini was loyal to the emperor. The result was the incredibly metal-sounding Eger bloodbath. All of the assassins were rewarded with lands and titles, though few lived long enough to enjoy them. The death of Wallenstein signaled the end of the age of the mercenary captain, the condottieri contractor, who arose during the Italian Wars to replace the aristocratic knights of the medieval era and would in turn be supplanted by corps of professional officers in the modern era. Military power, like the power to tax and administer justice, would be monopolized by the state if the state was to survive the maelstrom of the 17th century.
Do you think that there's a world where Wallenstein gets out of this alive, or at least not killed by his own boss?
I don't think so, because a deal required the emperor. So the idea that Wallenstein could make a deal behind his back was just never really plausible, because none of the people on the other side, the Swedes or the French, would have any confidence that the peace would be upheld if it didn't have the emperor's approval, and he didn't even know the negotiations were happening.
It's funny that the better Wallenstein is at his job, and he was one of the best, the more likely he is to just bump into the ceiling of power and be killed by his own employers.
Yep. But that's the thing. This whole war is a bunch of people testing the length of their power and then finding, to their horror, how little they actually have. Now, after an initial surge in interest in Wallenstein after his death, there was a play about him performed in London in 1640. The general's name kind of faded with time. But in the 19th century, Friedrich Schiller's trilogy of plays about Wallenstein would resurrect his name and turn him into a symbol of German romantic nationalism, dramatized as the man who could have banished imperial and Catholic backwardness from the land and unified the country under the light of German liberty hundreds of years earlier, which would have allowed Germany to take its place as the paramount nation of Europe. But in the immediate aftermath of his death, the tone of remembrance was somewhat different. An epitaph for Wallenstein, published in Vienna, Frankfurt, Zurich, and Stuttgart in March of 1634, read, "Here lies and rots with skin and bones the powerful warlord Wallenstein, who collected great military power but never delivered a battle. He did grant many great good, but more often he hung innocence. Through stargazing and long-windedness, he lost much land and many people. Too tender was his bohemian brain. He could not stand the ring of spurs. Cocks, hens, and dogs he robbed, in all places where he lodged. but he must go the way of death and let the cocks crow and the dogs bark. Now, that sounds kind of lame, but it rhymes in German, so it's probably pretty funny.
I mean, his tender bohemian brain. He's got one of these soft-brained bohemians.
Oh, yeah, you can't put him in charge of an army. What are you doing?
Here, though, we should also bid adieu to a much more pitiful character in this saga. Less than 2 weeks after Gustavus's death at Lutzen, Frederick V, ever exiled, ever wandering, found himself in the small town of Bacharach outside Maine. This town, like basically all of war-torn Germany, was suffering a bout of plague. And here, worn down, ever losing, the Winter King Frederick V of the Palatinate died at the age of 36 on November 29th, 1632. His body was evacuated and reinterred several times as various armies encroached on various cities it was placed in, and his body was last seen in a wine merchant's cellar near Metz. His final burial site is unknown. The originator of this whole conflict, the first loose thread, the one so many had fought and died for, the punkin instigator of the 30 Years' War, was dead, and it meant basically nothing for the conflict.
Amazingly, though, this was somehow not the last gasp of the Wittelsbachs in the Palatinate. So you might remember that during that brief honeymoon in Prague, Elizabeth and Frederick had a son,
Yes.
Who they named Rupert, after the only Wittelsbach Holy Roman Emperor. And this young man would grow to become sort of the flower of aristocratic chivalry during the age. For one thing, he was a little asshole who all of his servants hated and nicknamed Rupert the Devil. And that's key to being a aristocratic fancy boy. So he's born at the beginning of the conflict, and it's still going on when he's 18 in England in exile, where he offers a public subscription, which is essentially a military GoFundMe, to raise an army to put his brother, Charles Louis, on the throne of the Palatinate. His forces were defeated, and he was captured at the Battle of Vlotho in 1638. While in custody, he failed to bribe his captors. There was an attempted military rescue by French and Swedish forces that failed. He was offered his release if he converted to Catholicism, which he refused to do. And he was eventually released by promising the emperor's wife, Empress Maria Anna, that he wouldn't ever fight against Germany, cross his heart, swear to die. After he was released, he went to live with his mother's family, the Stuarts, in England. And this is not the last we will hear, just letting you know, of this dandy fop.
And there's also in the background prolonged attempts to put Charles Louis on the throne, and he's kicking around central Germany for a while. These guys...
They don't know how to take a fucking hint.
Yes. Just go live in The Hague.
And of course, the hilarious thing is, when the whole thing is said and done, they will get partial restitution of their claims, which just shows that there's really no justice for anybody in the world.
Yes. If there was one group who should have just been duly punished for their
they should have been made piss boys and grooms. They should have been forced to serve people flagons of ale, and they should not have been put back into anybody's manor house.
But there is no justice in central Germany in the 17th century. The death of Gustavus Adolphus had once again dissipated any momentum in the Protestant effort. I mean, these guys can just not keep it up. And the elimination of Wallenstein had similarly caused a major organizational blow for the imperial forces. With the two great generals dead and the guy who, this whole thing was kind of about also dead, one might think there would be some kind of motion for peace. But we'd still got armies in the field, continental power ambitions, and certain parties demanding satisfaction. The Swedish army now fell into the control of Axel Oxenstierna, a still tremendously capable diplomat and administrator, but lacking the generational martial prowess of Gustavus. Oxenstierna knew Sweden could not leave the conflict without some reward for its vast expenditures, and looked to keep Pomerania as a continental foothold for Sweden. Although he knew this would also require some kind of repayment to George William of Brandenburg to relinquish the territory. With Gustavus' 6-year-old daughter, Queen Christina, on the throne, and yes, that's another Christian Christina character in this, but she's not that important. You don't have to remember her too much. Swedish nobles were free to reassert some control at home, further undermining his position. And on a trip home, Oxenstierna had to liberate Queen Christina from her overbearing queen mother, who had locked the little queen away in a room with windows blackened out and nothing but fools and dwarves and elves for entertainment. A liberation. So Axel comes home and finds the queen locked in a room with a bunch of dwarf jesters while the queen mother's trying to run things. He solves this situation, and the Queen Christina would be forever grateful to Axel for this. But on the continent, Oxenstierna had, for the moment, brought major leaders of the Protestant forces together under Swedish direction in a new Protestant league, the Heilbronn League. In Spain, Oliveras wanted to continue the fight because keeping the Spanish road open was essential to Spain's ongoing conflict in the Netherlands. With Spanish financial inputs virtually dictating policy in Vienna, Oliveras could press Ferdinand to once again push his advantage against a weakened Protestant alliance. And then there was Cardinal Richelieu, whose chief foreign adversary remained the Spanish. Richelieu now found himself and France the sole viable linchpin of an anti-Habsburg alliance. And while there was conflict between the Spanish and the French, it would, for the moment, be fought in Germany.
So the deaths of Gustavus, and after 13 months of desultory combat, Wallenstein left both sides with significant leadership deficits. Oxenstierna passed over John George of Saxony, who he called an insignificant tosspot, to give command of the Heilbronn League forces to Bernard of the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar, who leveraged mutinous discontent among the poorly paid Swedish troops to gain huge grants of land and income for himself. By the way, that's the thing we haven't talked too much about, but this entire time this is happening, all of the armies are seeing nonstop mutinies as different companies and regiments say, we're not going to move, we're not going to lift up arms until we get paid or some guarantee of future payment. And for the most part, their commanders would just use their anger to extract more benefits to themselves, and then, of course, let a little bit trickle down to the troops, enough to keep them fighting, basically. Now, this didn't stop the Swedes from losing their hold on southern and northeastern Germany, where many of their former allies refused to join the Heilbronn League, and being forced to retrench closer to their Pomeranian bridgehead. Wallenstein's death allowed the emperor to sequester Wallenstein's lands, which gained for him a massive cash infusion, just as tax collection and agricultural production in a lot of Germany was breaking down.
Because Wallenstein, remember, by the time of his death, was the largest single landowner in Bohemia.
Yeah, and then all of that goes to the crown. It also gave Ferdinand a chance to put his son and heir, Archduke Ferdinand III, in overall command of imperial forces. But the prince would be sidelined by a different Habsburg named Ferdinand. God damn it.
Get some new names!
The new governor of the Netherlands, the Cardinal Infant. Not really a cardinal, because while he did have the office of a cardinal, he had never been ordained as a priest. And not really an infant, because infante was the Spanish term for a prince of the blood.
And sorry if I made that guy sound too much like an actual baby back in episode 1. That was just a funny image for me, a little baby in a cardinal's mitre. Hope you're not too disappointed. It's just another Ferdinand Habsburg, this one a Spanish one.
Cardinal Infant Ferdinand, who was King Philip IV of Spain's brother, and who raised an army of over 11,000 men in Italy and marched them over the Alps into Germany in May of 1634. A summer of maneuvers saw Protestant forces under Bernard and the Swedish general Gustav Horn attempt failed sieges of cities in and north of Bavaria, and Ferdinand's imperial troops successfully take the Bavarian city of Regensburg. By early September, the Cardinal Infant and Emperor Infant Ferdinands.
Sorry, this is so difficult. I hope this comes across. They're two
It's
Ferdinands.
okay. For the most part, you don't really need to know.
If they're named Ferdinand, they're a Habsburg.
That's a good
on
way
the
to
side.
And if they're Christian, they're probably a Protestant.
Yes.
They're George, they're German. It's fine. Don't
Yes.
worry about it.
It makes sense in the end.
Yeah. By early September, the Cardinal Infant and Emperor Infant Ferdinand's forces, numbering over 30,000, had linked up to lay siege to Nordlingen, 100 miles west of Regensburg. In an effort to lift the siege, the combined armies of Horn and Bernard, who rotated command on the march to preserve their egos, gave battle to the Spanish and imperial troops of the two Ferdinands at dawn on September 6th. The initial Swedish advance brushed aside green Bavarian recruits, but was eventually repulsed by seasoned Spanish tercios. At one point, a powder magazine exploded, causing chaos and confusion among the Swedish lines. The Swedes made several more attacks, but the superior numbers of the Catholic side allowed them to refresh their lines continuously. Also, the Spanish troops were able to neutralize the Swedes' most effective battlefield tactic, their coordinated volley fire, with one weird trick: ducking.
Swedes hate this one weird trick.
It's true. They had come to the continent and blown everybody's mind with their ability to
Fire
get everybody
rapidly.
firing at once. And eventually, the Spanish realized, well, we know they're going to fire. We just have to lay down for 1 second, and then they're fucked. Eventually, Imperial Croatian cavalry turned the exhausted Swedish left flank, and the rout was on. General Horn and 4,000 Swedish troops were captured. Many of them had been previously surrendered Imperial troops who'd been pressed into Swedish service, and them, along with a good number of Heilbronn League prisoners, ended up just signing papers and switching sides. 6,000 Protestant soldiers died on the field, with another 2,000 massacred when the Croatians seized the Swedish baggage train. Bernard of Saxe-Weimar was able to escape the debacle on a borrowed horse. To Oxenstierna, he reported, "The great misfortune is so bad, it could not be any worse." The Battle of Nordlingen was the greatest Habsburg victory since White Mountain, and it broke Swedish power in southern Germany for good. Oxenstierna tried to organize a counteroffensive, but his German allies, foremost among them good old Beer George of Saxony, refused to cooperate. The Emperor Ferdinand seized on this dissension in the Protestant ranks to offer an olive branch. Though Wallenstein had counted him too priest-addled to seek peace, by this point Ferdinand was aware that his fantasy of a truly Holy Roman Empire was just that. After a series of negotiations, the Emperor and John George, negotiating on behalf of the Lutheran princes, achieved a preliminary settlement in November that was formalized in May of 1635 as the Peace of Prague. The peace dissolved both the Heilbronn and Catholic leagues and revoked the Edict of Restitution, restoring the religious control of bishoprics, monasteries, and towns to what it had been in November of 1627. There was also a general amnesty for all who had fought against the empire, save the family of Frederick V.
Good. Get rid of these guys. And also, just on the Ferdinand Austrian Habsburg side, we'll see later on today that they take a lot of L's in the general battle, but all throughout this time, like what we were saying with Wallenstein, they were able to vastly consolidate the actual Austrian Habsburg lands and put Austria, Styria, Bohemia, Hungary under much more direct control of the Habsburgs. So they are getting victories there.
It's true. And a lot of those lands had been deeply evangelized in the previous generations, and that was fully reversed. The Counter-Reformation in the Habsburg lands was totally affected by, or was effectively total due to the outcome of the war. Now, this left the Swedes in an untenable position. Their influence waning, German allies demobilizing. The French subsidies had already been slowing to a trickle before the death of Gustavus and had dried up completely afterwards. So Oxenstierna put his foot down to Richelieu. If Sweden is going to keep fighting on behalf of French interest, France is going to have to start pulling their fucking weight. Richelieu had been happy to let others do the fighting and dying until now, but with Spanish garrisons along the Rhine now threatening French territorial integrity, he reluctantly agreed to commit troops to the war for the first time. After coordinating with the Dutch on a military campaign in the Netherlands, Richelieu came to an agreement with Oxenstierna. There'd be a resumption of increased subsidies to Sweden in exchange for a 60-mile corridor of land along the west bank of the Rhine that would be claimed by the French crown as crown lands, as well as an official declaration of war on Spain. Using the Spanish imprisonment of a French prelate as pretext, Richelieu went to war the old-fashioned way, just as Ferdinand was securing the Peace of Prague. As C.V. Wedgwood put it, he dispatched a herald and a trumpeter to Brussels, who, on the 21st of May, 1635, standing announced, after the proper fanfare, the King of France's just cause, and threw in the crowd a formal proclamation of war. Yeah! They then set spurs to their horses and galloped safely off. This would be the last war declared in Europe, using the proper chivalric ritual.
We should do that again.
Absolutely. Just chucking a fucking declaration of war into a crowd of people and running away.
Well, it's also, in our modern era world, in all these conflicts that are, where we're like lightly doing a war in, like Africa or whatever, we should have to send a guy with a trumpet to a place and be like, we are invading you now.
Yeah. Just drop a declaration of war out of a drone.
Now, this war began as a succession crisis in the Kingdom of Bohemia. And over the last 15 or so years, it had drawn in powers from across the continent, but all with the stated mission of confirming some party's legitimate prerogative over the German lands, whether it's for the privileges of the Protestant princes or the authority of the Catholic Empire. And yes, it's involved foreign intervention and deploying of foreign invading armies, but still with the aim of supporting an essentially German domestic conflict. At the point of the French invasion in 1635, after a mutually agreed domestic religious settlement, this distinction is over. Though it had always had some of these characteristics, the war was now primarily a continental power conflict fought on the ravaged soil of Germany. A struggle for hegemony between the two Catholic powers, Habsburg and Bourbon, simply waged where everyone had already set up their gear. As well, among the forces, the organizing principle of religion begins to fade into the organizing principle of the nation. The principle that the war was fought to ensure the correct way of worship among some people dissipated. Among the new generation of fighters, that matter was simply between an individual and their God, whether it was Catholic or Protestant. Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist became less important than French, German, Swede. At White Mountain, the Catholic battle cry was for Santa Maria, but by Nordlingen, they changed their cry to Viva España. The nature of the war itself begins to rapidly change as well. The objectives shift. This is no longer about gaining a victory more than it is about seeing the defeat of your enemies. The timescale changes. Armed conflicts of this period were already seasonal, with a campaigning summer and a quartered winter. And remember, we're in the little ice age right now. It's cold as shit for longer than usual, so you're spending most of your time just quartered in the cold. But increasingly, the conflicts and roving armies became enmeshed in the biological matrix of the countryside. Campaigning, camping, marching, and quartering based more on where food and shelter could be scavenged than based on any strategic military objective. The name of the game was attrition. Park your army in your enemy's territory for as long as possible, leeching resources out of the land more than they can take from yours. And the aim was not to win, but to just gain better terms at the eventual settlement everyone knew would come, but just wanted to be holding the best hand when it did. And so that's why this episode is hell. We'll be spending less time today reviewing the minutiae of the war. This army went here, this general changed sides, this city got sacked, as much as looking at the devastating full effects of this prolonged, indecisive war of attrition on the population. And since so much of life in Germany during the war was determined by proximity to one of the armies marching across the country, let's start by taking a minute to talk about the people those armies were actually made up of.
They came from all over the continent, from Madrid to Malmo, from Florence to Fife. Except for those conscripted by the Swedish Empire, they were signed up by an army recruiter, usually close to the town or village they came from. They tended to be town dwellers rather than peasants, and while a good amount, as many as 30% in some cases, became soldiers for lack of other employment options, most had some sort of trade. For their own reasons, they found life in the towns temperamentally unsuitable and sought something else. And army life sure was something else. Urbanity of a rougher, bloodier sort. Armies were essentially moving cities, with the number of troops dwarfed by a trailing retinue of servants, peddlers, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, hostlers, barbers, tailors, prostitutes, and families, because soldiers with wives and children brought them along on campaign. The military camp operated by its own internal laws. Discipline, such as it was maintained by officers, but conflicts between common soldiers were regulated by duels, fistfights, tribunals with military juries. Though religious differences helped shape the conflict, the armies did not enforce religious uniformity, with Calvinists fighting for Spain and Catholics for the Swedes. Piety was in short supply. Religious ritual tended to be organized around charging totems to make oneself impervious to bullets. The hierarchical social structure of the era was replicated in the army, but in a more intimate, streamlined form. Officers were mostly the landless sons of noble families. Nobles also predominated in the cavalry, where the cost of maintaining a horse limited recruitment. Even among the regular foot soldiers, there were ranks of honor. The most well-respected of common troopers were the pikemen, that respect due to the storied place of pikes in military tradition and the skill necessary to successfully wield one. Next were the halberdiers and those who fought with a sword and buckler, which is a small round shield. Last were the musketeers, whose martial prowess rested in their heavy matchlock musket, but not their person. These ranks also tended to correspond to pay, although in practice, how much a soldier was paid varied greatly between and within units. Experience and haggling ability were the final determiner of what salary a soldier agreed to with his recruiter. On paper, soldiers' pay was comparable to what a hired laborer could command in towns or during harvests, but in reality, pay was intermittent and often absent for months. Mutinies were a common way for troops to pressure their commander into paying back wages, but most mutinies were ended with small advances of cash and a promise of future restitution. Soldiers supplemented their wages with plunder, the ransoming of noble POWs, and even odd jobs. Many troops hired themselves out as watchmen. They were derisively referred to as guard connects. When soldiers did come into money thanks to their commander arranging a new line of credit or booty claimed during the sack of a town, they tended to orgiastically squander it, leaving them empty-pursed and miserable for long periods of time. The temptation to help oneself to the food and wealth of the civilian population was overwhelming. Non-combatants were seen as occupying a fundamentally different world than that of the soldiery, one that the troops felt no obligation to respect. Whatever words civilians might use for them, the troops referred to each other and their camp followers as Kriegsvolk, war people. Battles were rare, but hardship was endemic, with hunger, plague, and lice as constant companions. Yet this shared experience created a common vocabulary, culture, and sense of control that could not be found elsewhere. You might die bleeding on the field or shitting yourself in a latrine, but you marched unencumbered, your belongings carried by your woman or your servants. You were an emissary of the Red Horsemen. In a world where the elaborate pageants and gestures of social obligation had been stripped away, leaving only relationships of pure animal predation, it was better to be a wolf than a sheep, better a war person than a mere person.
In the last episode, we described the elation of the Protestant citizens of Erfurt when Gustavus's troops triumphantly entered the city. But the goodwill did not last long. Within a few months, a refugee from Erfurt reported, quote, "Not only are we oppressed by the tyranny of the imperialists, but the licentiousness of the Swedish soldiery is so great that we hardly know who is our friend." The inability and unwillingness of the princes and generals to keep their troops paid meant that encounters between troops and civilians became increasingly fraught with menace. That was true when the war still had some graspable aim, like Bohemian succession, or featured capable, charismatic leaders like Gustavus and Wallenstein. In their absence, all notions of cause or right dissolved in the face of a gnawing, ceaseless hunger.
Under the best of circumstances, the process by which troops extracted contributions from towns and villages was laden with the threat of violence. When a well-led military patrol entered a town with a competent council, accommodations could be made. When the Swedish army occupied Olmütz in 1642, the field marshal demanded a ransom of $150,000 to spare the town. The city council was able to bargain him down to $30,000 for the provision of his forces and a personal bribe of $4,000 to the marshal. Now, these sorts of delicate negotiations often determined the fate of a town. This is why the troops of both sides most feared and hated by the peasantry. For the Swedes, it's the Finnish Hakapaletta cavalry, and for the imperialists, the Croatian Kravats, were the most linguistically alien. Therefore, the most likely to simply take what they wanted from villagers rather than waste time in fruitless palaver. Some peasant communes would hire soldiers as watchmen or conscripted them into their feuds with neighboring villages. But even a peaceful occupation could be ruinous to a town.
That's just making me imagine a 30 Years of War Yojimbo or a Fistful of Dollars, where you get one of these mercenaries to guard your town and play both warriors against each other.
That happened all the time.
Yes.
There's documented cases all over Germany. The demands of an imperial detachment in the city of Bannerlord are instructive. For the officers, daily were demanded 2 jugs of wine, 1 keg of beer, 3 bushels of oats for 6 riding horses, 3 bushels of oats for 8 wagon horses, 2 cartloads of straw, 2 bushels of wheat, 2 fatted rams, and then per week, an entire cow. Now, that was just for the officers. For the 130 soldiers that they commanded, they all required daily 2 pounds of meat each, which is 250 pounds a day, and 1.25 pounds of bread, which ends up being over 1,000 pounds a week. Also, a keg of beer and a bushel of salt a day. So that's a company.
That's 130 guys and a few officers,
Yeah.
and we're talking about armies of 10, 20,
Yeah.
30,000.
An army of 30,000 required 30,000 pounds of meat and 20,000 gallons of beer a day. It is small wonder that a common metaphor to describe the ravening armies was a horde of locusts. God was delivering judgment as he judged the Egyptians.
just getting your head on what like the lifestyle and what the actual grounds of this place are. It's easy to think of these medieval production methods as having so much scarcity, but imagining a culture, a civilization right now that is capable of producing 20,000 gallons of beer a day all over the city, all over the country. It's wild. 20,000 gallons of beer a day for 30 years. I mean, of course, they were all drinking that themselves.
Yeah, and also the whole time this is happening, vast numbers of villagers are just starving to death in the countryside.
Contributions were not the only accommodations expected of townspeople. Troops were to be quartered in homes, their expenses paid for by the homeowners. From the diary of a Saxon household in 1637, at the beginning of this year, the Swedish general Bannerlord was here again. He again assigned our good city 24,000 florins for the arson prevention assessment, which is, paying the army to stop them from burning the towns down. It's a real nice bohemian village you got here. It would be a shame if it burnt to the ground, huh? He continues, I received as quartering in my house his regimental judge with his wife, 2 children, 1 maid, 1 servant, and a boy. This was a godless devil's pack. The man was Calvinist, the woman Catholic. They led such an Epicurean lifestyle that it is impossible to describe it. They invited similarly godless people as guests. They ate, drank, and whored all day and night, so that the food alone cost me 9 florins. Additionally, I was forced to give away a golden chain, which I had given my wife and she had sewn into her dress. I had to cut it out and give it to them. Also, because the wife of the regimental judge gave birth to twins, I had to arrange for the baptism festivity. Bro, they made you cut the gold chain out of your wife's gift dress and you had to pay for their kids' baptisms? It's brutally humiliating. A common figure of terror was the Brandmeister, carrying a giant smoldering torch good for burning down the huts of recalcitrant villagers. The power these armed, occupying troops had over their hosts was absolute and absolutely abused. In 1636 in Westphalia, a Hessian trooper cut off a carpenter's hand for failing to doff his cap fast enough. This, of course, inspired no respect among their hosts. A woman in Augsburg admitted to having cooked and eaten the body of a soldier who had died in her house during a siege. And this was under conditions of relative plenty. But the war ground on and armies tromped across the countryside so much in a strategically important area like Hohenlohe in the southwest, an observer could say, at times one cannot say with certainty who actually controlled the territory. The conditions of war took a brutal toll on the combatants. Of the 25,000 Swedish and Finnish troops who entered Germany in 1630, half were dead within 2 years. A single 1,000-man regiment lost 1/3 of their number to disease in that time, with another 1/6 dying of battle wounds and another 1/8 deserting. The constant demands of the soldiery destroyed any incentive for the peasantry to even grow crops. In the words of an English minister, Philip Vincent, who traveled through Germany during the war, quote, no tilling of the land, no breeding of cattle, for if they should, the next year the soldiers would devour it. No other abode but some camp, no other plow to follow, no other employment but the war. The Little Ice Age decimated those crops that were still being grown. In 1640, a Catholic soldier wrote that, at this time there was such a great cold that we almost froze to death in our quarters. Big deal, you might say, but that was in August. The Swedish army was able to cross the frozen Danube with their artillery to bombard Regensburg. Hailstorms and summer frosts obliterated plantings. Grain yields collapsed. The savagery that marked the war, and all wars, from the beginning, moved from the periphery of the experience to its bleeding heart.
Contribution gave way to straight pillage, with detachments of troops torturing peasants and townspeople for the location of hidden loot. Priests were disemboweled, children beaten and led on leashes by blood-drunk troopers. The Swedes, ever innovative in matters of war, devised a particularly effective form of interrogation, the Swedish drink. As a Thuringian pastor remembered, twice in 1 hour they gave me the Swedish cocktail, filled with manure drippings. My teeth were almost all loose after this, because as they put a big stick in my mouth, I resisted as I could while tied up. This was a mixture of manure, urine, and water poured down the throat until something came up. First vomit, then, hopefully, the location of jewelry, plate, or heirlooms that had been secreted by the family. The relationship between troops and common folk in Germany was summarized in a saying of the time. Every soldier needs 3 peasants, one to give up his lodgings, one to provide his wife, and one to take his place in hell. Peasant resistance to this reign of terror took several forms. Some armed peasants organized into bands, such as the Hartz Mountain Sharpshooters, who ambushed patrols, beating to death any soldier they could get their hands on. Isolated soldiers were always in danger of being waylaid by locals and tortured extravagantly. Other peasants fled into nearby forests to hide, with some villages emptying dozens of times over the course of the war. Many of those villages would be abandoned permanently as refugees sought safety elsewhere or died of exposure, plague, or encounters with marauding mercenaries. An account of one such harrowing encounter in Saxony in 1640 highlights another permanent feature of the war for Calradia in the countryside: sexual violence. A squadron of troops, having turned over every brick in an abandoned village, plunged into the neighboring forest, eventually coming upon the makeshift shelters of the refugee peasants. From the memoirs of a survivor, when hungry foraging parties came and found nothing and couldn't load themselves up with anything, then they vented their rage on the people. They caught them, beat them, and forced them to show where their people and their livestock were. They stripped males and females stark naked. They ravished decent women in the woods, and they bound maidens with straps to abuse them and led them to their quarters, and so disgracefully mishandled them that they died afterward. They took many females along with them to war. Others they took only to the nearest city and kept them only until they ransomed them. Many of these groups of soldiers had drifted away from their armies completely, living off their plunder. The roadways of Germany became nightmarishly dangerous, filled with wild boars and dogs and bandit deserters. The chronicler Volkmar Happ recorded an incident in which one group of Swedish soldiers, having stolen some peasants' horses, were robbed and relieved of the horses and their clothes by another group of Swedish troops. So, as Happ writes, one wolf devours another.
For one more picture of this hell, I want to read you a passage from The Adventures of Simplicius Simplicissimus, a German novel written by Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelhausen. This was written after the war, in the 1660s, but Grimmelhausen was born in Hesse, in central Germany in 1621 or 22, and experienced much of the 30 Years' War firsthand. As a youth, he was in fact a veteran of the war itself. Simplicius is a work of fiction, and the amount of it that's directly autobiographical is up for debate, but it's certainly one of the best literary fiction depictions of the era we have from someone who lived through it. And just incidentally, the book rocks. It's harrowing and funny, and the Penguin Classics edition is a really fun read. Plus it has a cool, gnarly skeleton shooting a bow and arrow on the front of it, so you look cool reading it. Highly recommend. So this is a scene narrated by our hero Simplicius, a kind of Huck Finn or Forrest Gump figure, a child bumbling along through the important events of the war. Here, he's accidentally led a company of soldiers back to his family's quiet and secluded forest home. The first thing the ruffians did was stable their horses. Then, each had his appointed task, which involved a lot of wrecking and spoiling. While some began butchering and boiling and roasting with every appearance of cooking up a feast, others ransacked the house from top to bottom. No room was safe. You'd have thought the golden fleece of Colchis was hidden somewhere. And some made piles of linen, clothes and household items as if for a jumble sale, and what they couldn't use they trashed. Others stabbed at heaps of hay and straw with their swords, as if they hadn't impaled enough sheep and pigs already. Another again shook the feathers out of the bed covers and filled them instead with hams, other dried meats and kitchen utensils, as if these would make for more comfortable sleeping. Stoves and windows were smashed to pieces, quite as if the Vandals forecast an eternal summer. Copper and tin pans were bashed in, and the dented and ruined bits carted off. Bedsteads, tables, chairs, and benches were all torched. Why, with stacks of firewood dry in the yard, if that was what they were after? Pots and dishes all had to be smashed, either because men preferred eating off the spit or because they knew they'd not be having another meal there. Our maid, I'm ashamed to say, was so abused in the barn that she couldn't walk afterwards. The stable lad they trussed up, laid him on the ground, wedged a stick between his teeth, and poured a milking pail full of a slurry down his throat. A Swedish toast, they called it. Afterwards, they made him lead a party out into the fields, from where they returned with men, women, and animals they'd rounded up. Dad, Mom, and our Ursula among them. Then they really got going. They removed the flints from their pistols and screwed the peasants' thumbs instead, hurting the poor fellows so awfully they might have been after witches. They did in fact bundle one prisoner into the bread oven and push fire in after him, even though he'd confessed to nothing. They took another, bound rope around his head, and wound the rope so tight with a stick that blood spurted from the man's mouth, nose, and ears. To cut a long story short, each soldier devised his own method of torture, and each peasant was put through his or her particular ordeal. Dad was the only lucky one, as I thought at the time. He was grinning and laughing all over his face when he owned up to what the others had screeched and mumbled in pain. I'm sure the honor was done him because he was the head of the household. What happened was they sat him in a chair by the fire, tied his hands and foot, rubbed his bare soles with dampened salt, which they then made our old goat lick off. That must have tickled so much that it made him laugh fit to burst. The sound was so catching I had to guffaw too, though whether to keep Dad company or through not knowing better, I can't say. And as he laughed, he owned up to them to where he kept his treasure, which included gold and pearls and jewelry, and a lot was more valuable than a farmer might have been expected to possess. As to what happened to the women and female servants and young girls they took prisoner, I can't tell you in detail. The soldiers wouldn't let me see what they did to them. I can imagine, though, partly from the pathetic screams that occasionally came from the corners of the house. And I don't suppose Mum or our Ursula fared better than the others. Through all this awfulness, I turned spits, and after the feast I helped water the horses, which is how I came across our milkmaid in the stable. She looked dreadfully disheveled, and I didn't recognize her until she spoke to me, her voice more than a bit wobbly. "Get away, lad, get away. Otherwise the soldiers will take you with them. Promise me, make yourself scarce. You can see how horribly..." But that was all she managed to get out. Throughout the country, the accounts of famine and deprivations create horrifying images. A soldier recounts seeing a woman gnawing on the same raw meat from a dead horse that a raven and wild dog were also picking at. The bodies of criminals were torn from the gallows and eaten. Guards were posted at graveyards to prevent the newly buried becoming food for the living. Mass graves of bodies, stripped of flesh and sucked to the marrow, were found. An English traveler at the time describes the unsettling feeling of traveling through a town completely devoid of life, though with one house still on fire. In another town, his party found the streets littered with dead, their starved mouths filled with the grass they had been chewing on when they finally died of famine. Finally, they encountered a town with some life, people splayed on dunghills, so weak they could barely crawl to his caravans to receive his alms. Plague persisted everywhere, particularly among armies in besieged cities. Plague would ravage cities during a siege, and when the siege was lifted, giving the beleaguered citizens hope for escape, sentries were posted at city gates with orders to shoot those who might venture out looking for food, lest they spread their disease. Soldiers would be abandoned, pushed out of wagon trains, and trampled into the mud as the army evacuated pestilent camps. Death, bodies, emptiness everywhere. From Wedgwood, the Swedes alone were accused of destroying nearly 2,000 castles, 18,000 villages, and over 1,500 towns. Bavaria claimed to have lost 80,000 families and 900 villages. Bohemia, 5/6 of its villages and 3/4 of its population. In Württemberg, the number of inhabitants was said to have fallen to a 1/6, in Nassau to a 1/5, in Hennenberg to a 1/3, and in the wasted Palatinate to a 50th of its original size. So I feel we should take stock now, after this litany of horrors that we see. It's striking to me how much, hearing that image of a woman gnawing at a horse, Hieronymus Bosch's Visions of Hell came to literal truth a few centuries later in his own landside.
Yeah, the apocalypse showed up. Like, that's the thing. Like, you read about the cyclical frenzies, the horror, the dread of the idea of God's judgment coming to earth, and you think, oh, these ignorant, superstitious peasants, but then it showed up at everyone's doorstep in Germany.
And it was originally from, again, these religious disputes of people attempting to, through their own divination of the true meaning of the Word of God, create an idea of paradise on earth, of these Calvinists and Lutherans believing that they were purifying the church to bring God's true vision of love onto the continent. And through that, created this conflict that brings this apocalypse to everyone.
And unlike previous wars in Europe, previous famines, previous plagues, which had all been monstrously traumatic and horrible, they had been so in a local, discrete context because of a lack of any kind of mass media to replicate the experience. But this war is the first to see newspapers and
Yes.
engravings and pamphlets filled with images and horrible stories about the violence taking place that had never happened before. Even those who were untouched by war, and there were some swaths of Germany during this time that were largely spared contact with any of this. Even there, they could share the trauma through this popular depiction of the violence in a way that had never been possible before the printing industry. And so this gore joins with God as grist for this cultural mill, creating a mood of apocalypse and horror.
But beyond the physical, material ruination of the continental population, the war brought another torture, that of the mind and the spirit. Another bout of apocalyptic millennialism emerged throughout Europe, with writers like Johann Alsted applying the academic logic of Calvinism to the prediction of the end of days. We also see a series of manias gripping the public. As the ravages of war and ice age plunged Germany into despair, fear took hold in the villages of that ancient great other, witches. The 1620s and 1630s in southern Germany saw some of the most intense witch hysterias in European history. In Bamberg, an independent Catholic prince-bishopric north of Nuremberg, between 1626 and 1632, over 900 individuals were tried and executed as witches. Similar deadly hysterias took place in nearby Würzburg around the same time, that one notable for its trial and execution of many religious officials and children, some as young as 4. Like these things often are, the Bamberg witch trials were encouraged by a particularly zealous leader, Catholic Prince Bishop Johann von Dornheim, who came to be called the Hexenbrenner, the witch burner. Though I must also shout out that the witch trials in Bamberg went back a few generations to one of his predecessors, whose name is the whimsical Natard von Thurngen. The number of trials ballooned exponentially through the practice of torturing the accused until they would confess, then torturing them more until they named multiple accomplices. Somewhat unusually, the witch hunters followed these accusations up and down the social ladder, subjecting burghers and peasants alike to trials, imprisonment, and burning. Then Dornheim had to eventually build a special prison, complete with torture chamber adorned with Bible verses, to hold all the supposed witches. Eventually, even the mayor, Johannes Junius, as well as the well-to-do doctor George Hahn, were accused. Junius was tortured with thumbscrews and the strappado until he confessed. That would be tying your arms together behind your back and then tying that to the ceiling and yanking you up and then dropping you by your arms behind your back until they would dislocate. The mayor Junius was publicly burned to death in 1628. George Hahn fled the cities to seek imperial intervention, but due to the war, Bamberg was cut off from the imperial authority. While a message urging her release was delayed reaching the city, his wife, Katharina Hahn, was burned for witchcraft. Mildly ironic to me that 400 years later, Catherine Hahn delighted certain audiences with her portrayal of an evil witch on TV. In the new, always some remnant of the old. Eventually, George, his wife, and 2 of their 5 children were executed for witchcraft. All the while, imperial authorities tried and failed to intervene against the proceedings. It was not until Protestant armies of Gustavus Adolphus were able to take control of the region that the witch hysteria was finally extinguished.
Cycles of witch mania had afflicted Germany since the mid-1500s, ignited by the social pressures of the Reformation and the general air of apocalyptic dread, but they reached a fever pitch in the middle of the 30 Years' War. The endemic misery and horror of the times demanded action. In Bamberg, for example, the bloodiest phase of witch trials occurred the same year that a late frost destroyed the entire local grain harvest. The peasant revolts of the first years of the war had been bloodily suppressed. No action against the perpetrators of war could be countenanced. Scapegoats would have to be identified to appease the wrath of God. It seemed that Christ's suffering had not erased the European impulse towards blood sacrifice after all. But not all outbreaks of witch hysteria resulted in mass torture and death. When accusations served the interests of local authorities, they resulted in trials, torture, escalating denunciations, and executions. When they did not, they were ignored or oppressed. As such, while witch trials occurred in many parts of ravaged Germany, the most intense bouts of violence occurred in places that had recently been re-Catholicized by the emperor. The process empowered local power holders to impose religious uniformity on aggressive crypto-Protestant populations and direct popular rage away from rulers and towards social outcasts. Another factor pushing people towards superstitious communal savagery was our good old friend, the printing press. Specifically, the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written by a crank priest and inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer in 1486, the book went through 28 editions by the year 1600. In Kramer's time, witch trials were relatively rare, and he was actually expelled from Innsbruck in Austria for his overly inventive and sexually obsessive attempts at spectral prosecution. Basically, he is a fruitcake. And he wrote the Malleus to justify himself to all the haters and losers. Though the church condemned Kramer's theorizing and the Inquisition did not use the book in any of their legal proceedings, it quickly captured the imagination of literate minds and became a staple of Renaissance courts, with its pseudo-authoritative explication of how witches are brought into Satan's service, how they seduce and ruin godly people, and how they are best to be dealt with. Witches, according to Kramer, are predominantly women, due to the inherent weakness of those formed from a bent rib, as well as the many carnal abominations of that sex.
Yeah, right, dude. Yeah.
Witches he's got no problems. He's normal. He's a normal guy. Witches had sexual intercourse with the devil. They killed babies in the womb and could change men into beasts. Witches could even work some prestidigitory illusion so that the male organ appears to be entirely removed and separate from the body, or even deprive men of their virile member altogether. Lots of stuff about dick theft.
Penis panics are something that occur throughout all different types of cultures throughout history. It's an interesting thing to look into. We just periodically, every 100 years or so, some group somewhere gets obsessed with the idea that some foreign force is going to come and steal their penises.
It's almost like their sense of disempowerment is translating into sexual pathology. Now, the witches could control the weather, they could destroy crops. In short, they could bring every manner of misfortune to an innocent village, like all the things that had been happening in Germany during the 30 Years' War. And the only remedy, torture to the point of confession and death by burning at the stake. Now, as with the Rosicrucian pamphlets that appeared just as Frederick V's court moved towards their great project in Bohemia, the Hammer of Witches provided a common vocabulary and context for people facing dramatically changing times. Absent responsive political institutions, the crop failures, plague outbreaks, and multiplying miseries of war could be made sense of with the available social materials. The Malleus helped create a shared imaginative world where suffering could be transformed into social power through a process, a legal, rationalized process of identifying and punishing those who activated social anxieties, particularly around femininity. Women made up a majority of victims. There are plenty of historians, however, who argue that the Hammer of Witches was not particularly influential in generating witch trials, but rather kind of serves as a written artifact that can be used retrospectively to give shape and coherence to a phenomenon that was much wilder and more inexplicable than historical narrative can grasp.
It's a manual of witch mindset.
Now, as is usually the case, both of those interpretations contain truth. It's just a frustratingly unknowable ratio. But what can't be denied is the results of the hysteria. In 1627, the Catholic mercenary Peter Hagendorf wrote in his diary of his encounter with this sinister current of war. In Lippstadt, there's good old beer and also bad people. I saw them burn 7. Among them was even a beautiful maiden of 18, but she was burned.
I read, as I was researching this, there is a famous litany that just recounts who is burned in several of these burnings. They would do batch burnings, and 4 or 5 people would be burned at a time. It is very interesting to just go through and be like, and it's listed as like, George William, the fattest man in town, 3 strangers, the most beautiful woman in town, the fat wife of the richest man in town. It's this interesting mix of nobles, rich people's wives, and then literally just strangers they'd find in the woods, and just because they didn't know them, burn them alive.
All the people who burn.
So, Where violence and destruction and fear reign heaviest, we see this one type of hysteria, the fanatical purging of imagined supernatural evil. But a few hundred miles away, in a place where people are actually making money off the war, we see a very different hysteria, one that nonetheless reflects the specific new kinds of supernatural forces gripping the population. Because just as the witch craze was winding down in Bavaria, tulip mania was gearing up in the Dutch Republic. And 1634 to 1637 would see one of the world's first documented speculative bubbles rock the Dutch economy. The first tulips were sent to the Low Countries by one of the Habsburgs' ambassadors to the Ottomans in the 1550s, were successfully cultivated there by the 1590s. The tulips bred in the Netherlands had spectacular colors and patterns that took years of dedicated breeding to bring forth. And as the independence and commercial fortunes of the Dutch grew during the first decades of the 17th century, the tulip became an incredibly sought-after luxury good. Trading in desirable tulip bulbs based around anticipated sales in their blooming season became a huge commodity in the growing Dutch markets. And by the 1630s, a semi-formalized futures market had developed to speculate on the contracts to purchase these bulbs, rather than the bulbs themselves. Tulips became one of the Republic's chief exports, right behind gin and herring, as massive fortunes were moved through the market. The craze reached its peak in the winter of 1636 to 1637, when some tulip futures contracts were being traded a half dozen times without any actual bulbs changing hands, all while constantly rising in prices. Single tulip bulbs were being priced at nearly 15 times the annual salary of a skilled craftsman. One trader reported 12 acres of land offered for a single bulb. Until, in February of 1637, when the bottom dropped out of the market and prices rapidly depreciated, leaving traders holding futures to now worthless bulbs contracted at exorbitant prices, and necessitating petitions to the government to step in and regulate and arbitrate the market. Now, to be clear, the extent of the impact of this whole episode is still debated. Financial records from the period are spotty, and some of the best transaction details come from a satirical play written about the stock traders of the time. The incident could have affected vast swaths of the Dutch population or a relatively small clique of well-off traders. But what is clear is that at the height of the war, the booming Dutch economy generated one of the first clearly recognizable speculative bubbles. A hysteria for trading, rampant overvaluation of the material was clearly felt in society. As contemporary art depicts commodity traders as gibbering monkeys, and a crowd of weavers abandoning their trade to follow a wagon blown by the winds of fortune and guided by the goddess of flowers.
At this point, the Dutch commercial economy, forged in the fires of war and religious fervor, was the most highly developed in the world, leading to an unprecedented concentration of financial capital in Amsterdam. Feudal lords spent their surpluses on luxury goods to compete with other lords for splendorous prestige. The Dutch burghers, on the other hand, in their humble black frock coats and hats, set their money back out into the world to reproduce, for the glory of God and the Dutch Republic and their own family lines, who would hold their stock certificates and corporate board seats in perpetuity. The search for greater and greater returns on investment led them to the tulip, a luxury good now accessible to the common people and capable of providing massive profits to the elites who could sell to them. Catholic superstitions and rituals may have been banished from the United Provinces, but the deeper human mystic urge had not dissipated. Rather, it moved from the symbols of bread and wine to guilders and contracts. Tulip mania was the religious impulse, the trembling prostration before the divine, flowing out of the bare, empty chapels and into the market stalls.
Now, did the 30 Years' War cause these hysterias? Well, I would say, to paraphrase Arrested Development, it certainly didn't help.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, what you do see is a shockingly recognizable context with multiplying crisis conditions and a society dealing with an information revolution and a overload, a new access to knowledge that had never before been possible, leading to this just a speculative frenzy, a mania for scapegoats, for profits generated by the fact that the world seemed accessible in a way it never had before. But in reality, that knowledge was mostly an illusion.
So, as we transition out of the hell portion of this episode and return once again to the actual course of the war, we've been covering the progress of this war fairly in depth up to this point, down to the minute progress of specific battles. But now
we're going to start yada-yadaing a little bit because, frankly, from this point on, any victories, losses, setbacks, and movements, it all becomes more immaterial. The positions are entrenched. A bunch of guys move to one place. Their enemies move to where they were. They fight. They trade places. They do it again. We're going to try to run through the back end of the war and give you a sense of where things move briefly, but, really, it don't matter. None of this matters.
None of this matters.
Yes. So, in December 1636, the Imperial Diet met at Regensburg. The Emperor's position at this moment was fairly strong, but for a few recalcitrant princes still in rebellion, most notably Bernard of Saxe-Weimar, who becomes basically the most important German prince in the back end of the war, Ferdinand II commanded the allegiances of most of his subjects. With the Edict of Restitution revoked, the electors of Bavaria, Brandenburg, and Saxony were all by his side. And yes, if you're keeping track, and you should because this will all be on the test, Beer George has now gone from neutral to the Swedes to neutral to the Emperor in the span of, 3 or 4 years? Something like that. With broad favorability, his son performing well on the battlefield, the Peace of Prague signed. It was at this meeting that the Diet finally confirmed Ferdinand III as King of the Romans, lining him up to replace Ferdinand II as the Holy Roman Emperor. With this final position secured, perhaps Ferdinand knew his work was essentially done. He returned to Vienna and arrived with his health fading. On February 15, 1637, he died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by his wife and daughter and church officials. He was 59 years old. The war had lasted 18 years under his rule. It still had no end in sight. But he had been able to virtually rid Austrian lands of Protestantism, destroy the mutually threatening Catholic League and Protestant Union, extend Habsburg control and counter-reformation to Bohemia, bring a preponderance of German princes once again under control of the emperor. His son would continue the Habsburg line of Holy Roman Emperors, and his son was married to Maria Anna of Spain, potentially reconciling the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lines. It is virtually assured that when he died, he believed God would welcome him as a noble warrior for the kingdom of heaven. But for his victory in God's name, his realm had been destroyed, converted almost in totality to a playground for the uncontrolled and uncontrollable soldiers. Women robbed and raped, some reported boiled alive by imperial troops in their own kitchen cauldrons, children stolen for ransom and pressed into military service, priests roped to wagon trains and forced to crawl like dogs behind them until they collapsed, the wholesale pillaging of the land, terrorizing of the people, war and pestilence and famine, the true rulers of the era. Perhaps this is what Ferdinand would truly be judged for.
Ferdinand II was, in many ways, the last Holy Roman Emperor. He was brought up with an understanding of his position, nurtured in the stately opulence of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, tutored in the eternal majesty of the Catholic Church that was no longer consonant with the empire he claimed to rule. The old verities could no longer hold together, a fractured territory teeming with hyper-competitive declining elites and rising urban merchants who took their identities from books rather than church rituals. But there was no way for Ferdinand to know this. You could only find out by trying to test the real extent of his power. It was his duty to God to exert his entire influence on the souls of his subjects. In doing so, he destroyed his country for a generation. He would not be the last ruler of Europe to only discover the extent of their impotence when it was too late to reverse it.
Ferdinand II was succeeded by his son, Ferdinand III, who was already the king of Hungary and now the commander of the imperial forces. Ferdinand III shared many of the traits of his father, but leaned more towards the philosophical and artistic than the staunchly Catholic. He's actually one of the only Habsburg rulers to have been a musical composer, and let's roll some of those Ferdinand III compositions under here. Between his more lenient Catholicism and speaking 7 languages, he was a bit more well-suited for the diplomatic role he would play in his reign than his father. But perhaps he came off in court as more intellectual than he actually was. He was, quote, too clever to be happy, but not clever enough to be successful.
Buddy, I know the feel.
As well, Emperor Ferdinand III had grown in an era where the Holy Roman Empire, as it was, had been nothing more than a collection of warring principalities, never a concrete entity to draw pride, prestige, or power from. His allegiance to any idea of the empire was distant, theoretical. His allegiance instead was to the Confederation of Bohemia, Austria, and Hungary his father had consolidated under the personal rule of the Habsburgs. So then let's turn back to the war itself and try to pull this thing to its bitter end. After the death of Adolphus, French influence increasingly took over the Protestant alliance. Of all the independent German princes, Bernard of Saxe-Weimar becomes the only major domestic Protestant force, and by 1635 he was made commander of German forces under a joint French and Swedish alliance, with the promise of becoming the Landgravite of Alsace dangled in front of him. Meanwhile, Richelieu was struggling with France's increased obligations. Fielding a French army was frustrating to the cardinal, since the French relied on their feudal method of delegating to various aristocrats to raise troops, which in turn empowered the recalcitrant French nobles against the monarchy. So then, Richelieu relied on the vast wealth of France to keep armies, like the one of Bernard of Weimar, paid. And France was now supporting armies in Italy, Germany, the Dutch Republic, and the French frontier with Spain, both in the south at the Pyrenees and in the north at the Netherlands. All this caused Richelieu to squeeze France's archaic tax system to pull funds out of the poorest in the kingdom. But this all drove the cardinal to professionalize the army as much as he could, encouraging skill over numbers, reducing the massive traveling camps of followers, opening paths for promotion by skill rather than noble birth, and within a decade creating a much leaner and more efficient French military. Also notable here was limiting the system of just conscripting the army with captives from the defeated enemy, which then diluted the skill officer pool. Now those guys got shipped off to the Navy to be slaves in the galleys.
Efficiency, we love it.
We love efficiency. So with all that wind up, let's drive this thing home.
So in 1635, the French form an alliance with the Swiss Confederation and invade and occupy the Val Thorens, that crucial alpine valley that linked Italy to Germany on the Spanish road, once again cutting off the Spanish from resupplying the Netherlands. In the summer of 1636, the Cardinal Infant Ferdinand, along with Imperial German allies, make a joint push into France. They get as far as Corbeil, within 100 miles of Paris, before the alliance falls apart for lack of organization and leadership. Now, many of the campaigns of the second half of the war can be described this way. Armies are formed, march into enemy territory, and in the face of plague outbreaks and collapsing infrastructure, just melt away into the countryside. Shortly after this, the Swiss make another deal with the Spanish and sell control of the Val Thorens in exchange for religious liberties. The French are pushed out of the region, and the Spanish road is reopened.
In the north, in October 1636, the Swedes win a victory at Wittstock in Brandenburg and successfully reestablish a commanding Swedish presence in northern Germany. In the spring of 1637, Bernard Saxe-Weimar wins a series of battles in the Rhine. Then, in 1638, wins a protracted siege at Breisach. This secures the Alsace for the French and once again cuts off the Spanish road. In October 1637, Frederick Henry of Orange takes Breda on the Dutch-Flemish border, a key defeat for the Spanish and the Cardinal Infant.
There's actually a funny story there. So Breda had been taken by the Spanish, and Diego Velázquez was commissioned to do a painting of that to celebrate it. And it was revealed basically exactly at the moment that the Dutch took Breda back. In April and May of 1639, Swedish forces under Marshal Banner pushed John George out of Saxony and back into Bohemia. The Swedes march forth, but are rebuffed at Prague. Banner reports from the region at this time, "I had not thought the kingdom of Bohemia so lean, wasted, and spoiled. For between Prague and Vienna all is razed to the ground, and hardly a living soul to be seen in the land." Also in 1639, Bernard Saxe-Weimar makes a bold play against his French allies to demand outright control of Alsace for himself. But a few weeks later, he dies of a sudden fever. In his will, after a nominal attempt to find a German willing to take him, he leaves Alsace and his armies to France. With the death of Bernard, the final German prince of any importance passes. The Protestant cause, the cause of German liberties, is now wholly in the hands of foreigners and German lands.
Meanwhile, Spain is getting absolutely eaten alive by the Dutch. Their economy was collapsing so thoroughly under inflation, many Spanish cities were resorting to barter for trade. Spain was losing the mercantile war so badly that as many as 3/4 of ships carrying goods into Spain itself were Dutch. In October 1639, a massive fleet of 77 Spanish ships was routed by the Dutch at the Battle of the Downs. The Spanish fleet was driven into neutral English waters and decimated, with 70 ships being sunk or taken. This effectively ended any pretensions of Spanish control over the English Channel. The seas were orange now. So, now cut off from supply by both land and sea, the Spanish Netherlands withered. By 1640, they were being asked to send troops and supplies to Spain. Under enormous pressure and unfillable contradicting orders, the Cardinal Infant dies on November 9th of that year. On the imperial side, lack of Spanish subsidies and general death or capture of most of their officer class led to disarray. At this point, the army was little more than a massive blob of scavenging men, impossible to coordinate and just wandering off whenever the chance for booty appeared.
In January 1641, a Swedish army attempts to intimidate the imperial diet at Regensburg out of its sessions, but Ferdinand calls their bluff, stands his ground, and the forces of the Swedes must back off. But around this time, George William, the Elector of Brandenburg, died, and his successor, his son, George Frederick, having surveyed the horrors and devastation that had been wrought and being forced to flee his residence in Berlin for one in Königsberg because the roof was literally falling in, went behind the emperor's back to sue for an armistice with Sweden. The Peace of Prague in 1635 had been a genuine compromise. Now, with the damn French storming around the place, it looked like obstinance. Ferdinand III, unlike his more stubborn father, realized this and prepares for future diplomacy.
The Swedish Marshal Bannerlord dies, having gone slightly nutty at the end after his beloved wife died. He actually, in a scandalous move, marries a much younger woman in the army camp. And towards the end of his life, his soldiers are gossiping that he's just spending all his time hanging out with her young friends and partying. So he dies and is replaced by Leonard Torstensson, who puts the army under brutal discipline to regain order. But he also does away with the last pretense of pay for the army services and fully legalizes the system of plunder and looting the army had been surviving off of. Torstensson attacks down through Moravia and towards Vienna until he's pushed back up by Archduke Leopold, Ferdinand III's brother, who is now in charge of the imperial army. The Swedes and Imperials confront each other again at Breitenfeld on November 2nd, 1642. Leopold gets washed at Second Breitenfeld, and the Swedes again take Leipzig to dominate Saxony. Philip IV of Spain was going to appoint Leopold as the new governor of the Netherlands, but suddenly decides to appoint his 12-year-old bastard son Don John to the post. One final rupture in the Austrian-Spanish trust.
In December 1642, Cardinal Richelieu dies. R.I.P. to a true legend there. He's administered on his deathbed by Louis XIII himself, who lovingly fed him egg yolks as he slipped away. What a weirdly sweet image. Richelieu is succeeded by his Italian mini-me, Cardinal Mazarin, who largely continues his policies. Louis XIII then also dies on May 14, 1643, less than a year later. He is succeeded by his 5-year-old son, Louis XIV, heard of him, and his queen mother regent, the confusingly Spanish Anne of Austria. On May 19th, 5 days after the death of Louis XIII, the French army issued a crushing defeat to the Spanish at Rocroi on the French-Flemish border. A century of military, technological, and tactical innovation had finally caught up with the indomitable Spanish Tercio infantry formation. The Tercios at Rocroi withstood heavy assaults during the battle before being pounded into submission by withering artillery and harassing cavalry. The Spanish eventually would be forced to abandon the Tercio, along with their hopes of ever reclaiming the United Provinces. So profound was the defeat that Wedgwood refers to the Rocroi Battle Monument as the gravestone of Spanish greatness.
Rocroi would be the last major real contest of forces in the 30 Years' War. 5 weeks after the battle, Ferdinand III called for negotiations with France and Sweden. After 25 years of conflict, it was time to come to the table. Now, it's 1643, and fighting and negotiations would continue for another 5 years to bring us up to that nice round 30. But at this point, basically all parties involved realized that the conflict would not and could not be won in an overwhelming military victory.
A tax official for Brandenburg wrote his armies were rampaging across his home state. This whole war has been a veritable robbers and thieves campaign. The generals and colonels have lined their purses while princes and lords have been led around by the nose. But whenever there have been talk of wanting to make peace, they have always looked to their reputations. That's what the land and people have been devastated for. Now, although the hope of either side to achieve a military victory had long dispersed, the combatants up and down the chain of command were all still locked into an unalterable logic of war. The incentive of the warlords commanding armies in the field was clear. War was an opportunity to win lands, riches, and titles. The Swedish general Melander, the son of a peasant farmer, fought his way up to a counthood. Now, even the agonies of life in camp were soothed by the ability of military elites to command a lion's share of contributions and loot. Theirs were the last stomachs to go hungry. And the common soldiers, shivering under tents and eating their shoes, fought on because it was better to be in the camp than to have their tents and shoes taken from them by other men with guns. And those great princes, while much more comfortable than anyone in the field, were just as enthralled to Mars. Every consideration of state demanded continued conflict. For the emperor, any lasting peace settlement would need to include an amnesty for all who took up arms against him. Without that, no one would have an incentive to stop fighting. But any amnesty worth the paper it was printed on would include a restitution of lost lands and titles. Those lands and titles were all spoken for, having been distributed to imperial allies as reward and payment for services. How could they be dispossessed? That gave the emperor hope that he could extort on the battlefield an acknowledgement of loss of property as the price for peace. Meanwhile, Sweden was stuck in a Central European quagmire that had all the hallmarks of the failed imperial counterinsurgency campaigns of later centuries. With a dissolving support base, increased elite resistance at home, spiraling war debt, the need to defend Swedish claims to conquer German lands, and no plausible exit strategy, all leading to fatal strategic paralysis. Then, of course, the main antagonists, France and Spain, were locked in a mutually recognized existential contest for primacy in European affairs. No one, regardless of the bloodshed and devastation wrought, could be the first to sue for peace. The loss of reputation, the coin of the diplomatic realm, would be too great. As long as the war could be paid for, it would be fought. And it was the question of paying for the war and the impact the war effort had taken on the common people of Europe that finally drove the belligerents to the negotiating table. The peasantry of Germany had been bled dry, burned out of their homes, and harried into the wilderness. In much of the country, sovereignty above the level of the commander of the nearest armed camp did not exist. The peasant uprisings of the early years had all been bloodily suppressed. Defeated but still defiant villagers might band together to ambush military patrols and publicly display the corpses of tortured soldiers as a warning to others, but by the 1640s, all most peasants could manage was to keep one step ahead of the wolf. Even the politically febrile urban merchant and political classes suffered domination by permanent martial law. But in France, and in the Spanish lands of Iberia and southern Italy, where rural peasant, urban merchant, and aristocratic society still functioned, people outside of the circle of royal power were eventually able to mobilize an answer to the extortionate demands of the fiscal military state war machine. As a consequence of these struggles, which we'll talk about next episode, the two chief dynastic antagonists of the war, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, finally had sufficient incentive to risk sacrificing some reputation to hold on to their power.
It took a little bit of time to actually get this thing together, thanks to some stupid dicking around by the Danes of all people, which we might touch on next week as well. But on December 4th, 1644, a Congress that would eventually include over 100 individual delegations was opened in the towns of Münster and Osnabrück in the German region of Westphalia. Here, while armies continued to ravage German lands, the Peace of Westphalia would be negotiated. And out of the chaos of war, a new vision for the state would slowly emerge. Hell on Earth is written by Matt Christman and Chris Wade. It's produced by me, Chris Wade, with editing from our co-producer, Nick Quaz. Show art and animation is from the great Ben Clarkson, and you can find a supplemental interactive atlas for the series by John White over at hellonearth.chapotraphouse.com. Our theme music is by Nick Diamonds, with additional music by Tyrant King, Takeshi Alessandro, Frederick Scarfone, John Ahrens, Blackout Princess, Wagner Coop, and Ferdinand III Habsburg. Join us next week for peace and a new war.